I'm live. This is the special Juneteenth stream. It's not Juneteenth now, but I'm streaming getting ready. This is going to be leading into Juneteenth, God willing. Adjust some of the lighting here. What's up, Urameshi? How you doing? Let me, So I'm not gonna lie to you guys. I'm a little unprepared for this stream. Thank you, Jenna. How you doing? It's not that I'm unprepared. I have a plethora of knowledge about the subject. I honestly just don't know where to begin or how to move. I'm doing alright. I'm doing alright. I wish I didn't have to work today, but it's all good. Excuse me. How you doing, Urameshi? Oh wait, I already asked you. How you doing, Jenna? What's up, Fade Runner? So I'm actually not doing the news today, Urameshi. I want to talk about Juneteenth, why it's important, and like how it relates to modern times. And what's up, Fade Runner? And also probably give a little bit of personal history about me and my family while we're at it, because it's heavily relatable. Um, Thank you for the like, Donald. Let me see if I can find. Uh, Let me see. Okay, so 62. Okay. What's up, Silly Kelso? So I'm just gonna read I got the Smithsonian link to the history of Juneteenth. I guess I'll start with that. So this is from the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. I'm just gonna start reading because I feel like a decent amount of people are here now. I should also mention that all the donations that I received today will be sent to the Reginald F. Lewis Museum. Before I get started, we can check that out. Hang on. It's a museum here in Baltimore. Some of you might have seen it before. If you've never been to Baltimore, it's in a pretty prominent part of the city. It's at the intersection of Pratt Street and President Street. They keep things relevant to African American history here in Maryland. Let me see if I can find anything cool. Yep, here we go. Permanent collections. So let's check out this museum first, and then I'll get into Juneteenth. So I guess there's artifacts from when slaves were first brought here. Military collection. This is a sword. I don't know if you guys have seen like Forgotten Weapons. Or not Forgotten Weapons, but Deadliest Warrior. It's one of the weapons that was on Deadliest Warrior, called an Agombe. There's a bunch of other stuff. The military collection was very interesting. The exhibit on World War II was very interesting. Lots of different music related stuff, photographs. They did Zulu so dirty in the episode. They certainly did. It was kind of depressing. But so yeah. Suffice it to say, this museum is really cool. I've only been there once, but I really enjoyed it. They have really good stuff. So if you donate the stream, you can donate at endlesscemetery.com. And anything I receive there, I will send straight to this museum. What's up, Cookie Granny? Let's see, what did you send me? Scary movie. Okay. All right. Cool, Cookie Granny, I guess. So anyway, that's that. Not a movie, a clip. Cool. So I'm going to read this. On Freedom's Eve, or the eve of January 1st, 1863, the first night watch services took place. On that night, enslaved and free African Americans gathered in churches and private homes all across the country awaiting news that the Emancipation Proclamation had taken effect. At the stroke of midnight, prayers were answered as all enslaved people in Confederate states were declared legally free. Union soldiers, many of whom were black, marched on the plantations and across cities in the South, reading small copies of the Emancipation Proclamation, spreading the news of freedom in Confederate states. Only through the 13th Amendment did emancipation end slavery throughout the United States. Before I continue, I want to read the 13th Amendment. Thank you, Joe Snyder. I appreciate that, my guy. So, because this is kind of important. So, this is the 13th Amendment. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, this is important, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, right, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So basically what this means is slavery in terms of public slavery. How can I word this? They basically not collectivized, but slavery became something that only the state can do. You can't be a private entity with slaves anymore. Slavery is now something exclusively a power that the state has, right? So, I'll read it again just to make that clear for everyone. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist in the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Nowhere does that say slavery has been completely abolished. Slavery cannot happen on United States soil, right? It's very important. It makes a very important distinction that slavery is specifically reserved as punishment for a crime wherein the party has been duly convicted. So what that means is if you get convicted of a crime, the state has the right to punish you by making you into a slave. And once you understand that, you can understand the criminal justice system in America and the way that it functions and how the police work. All that stuff will begin to make perfect sense to you once you realize that slavery never actually went away in this country. They just made it a punishment for crime. Okay, so I'm going to continue reading this thing on Juneteenth now. But not everyone in Confederate territory would immediately be free. Even though the Emancipation Proclamation was made effective in 1863, it could not be implemented in places still under Confederate control. As a result, in the westernmost Confederate state of Texas, enslaved people would not be free until much later. Freedom finally came on June 19, 1865, when some 2,000 Union troops arrived in Galveston Bay, Texas. The Army announced that the more than 250,000 enslaved black people in the state were free by executive decree. This day came to be known as Juneteenth by the newly freed people in Texas. If you look up what year a lot of big prisons were built, they were built from 1865 to 1870. Yes, that's very true, Crandon Raspberry. That's also a very important piece of the puzzle. Sorry, I had to update a hashtag there. So basically, the prison industrial complex, as you know it, was built completely around this concept of reserving slavery exclusively as punishment for a crime, making it so that only the state can enslave people, which in turn would mean that only the state can profit off of slavery, which makes sense in the context of what Abraham Lincoln's thoughts were and what his motivations were at the time when he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation and when he was trying to bring in the Confederacy into the Union, right? The post-emancipation period, known as Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877, which is also the same period of time when a lot of these major prisons were built, marked an era of great hope, uncertainty, and struggle for the nation as a whole. Formerly enslaved people immediately sought to reunify families, establish schools, run for political office, push radical legislation, and even sue slaveholders for compensation. Given the 200 plus years of enslavement, such changes were nothing short of amazing. Not even a generation out of slavery, African Americans were inspired and empowered to transform their lives and their country. Juneteenth marks our country's second Independence Day. Although it has long been celebrated in the African American community, this monumental event remains largely unknown to most Americans. The historical legacy of Juneteenth shows the value of never giving up hope in uncertain times. The National Museum of African American History and Culture is a community space where this spirit of hope lives on. A place where historical events like Juneteenth are shared and new stories with equal urgency are told. So what's important to know about, like I said this Wednesday in the last stream, this piece makes it sound really optimistic and like it was very hopeful, but in reality, it was fucking terrifying because, like I said before, freedom is very scary, right? So this is like 200 plus years of slavery, right? So this is like 3 generations, 4 generations, maybe even 5 generations of enslaved people who have been ripped from their homeland, taken across the sea, made into cattle so that they could profit for these other people. Their children are taken away from them. Their children are sold. Their children are raped. All of this stuff. And those same children, same thing is done to their children and their children and so on and so forth. Until one day, someone tells you, hey, guess what? You don't have to do this shit anymore. You're free, right? What do you do after that? When all you know is this system that has destroyed your people, right? So that's kind of where things happen there. Let's get into the Emancipation Proclamation because it's important. I'm hoping this gets into Abraham Lincoln's views on the Negro, as he said. On September 22nd, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that as of January 1st, 1863, all enslaved people in the states currently engaged in rebellion against the Union shall be thenceforward, and forever free. Lincoln didn't actually free any of the approximately 4 million men, women, and children held in slavery in the United States when he signed the formal Emancipation Proclamation the following January. The document applied only to enslaved people in the Confederacy and not to those in the border states that remained loyal to the Union. So Maryland is one of those states. And Maryland was a state where you could be sold south. The movie 12 Years a Slave or whatever, that kind of stuff happened in Maryland, where you would just be kidnapped in the night, and it's called sold south, where you were just treated as a slave. And because you were black, it didn't matter if you were free or not, because that's not how the country was set up. So, but although it was presented chiefly as a military measure, the proclamation marked a crucial shift in Lincoln's views on slavery. Emancipation will redefine the Civil War, turning it from a struggle to preserve the Union to one focused on ending slavery, and set a decisive course for how the nation will be reshaped after that historic conflict. So, before I get any further, actually, I'll get into Abraham Lincoln's thoughts on Negroes after this, because I think this might actually go into it. This is also from the History Channel, so it's going to be a little biased, clearly, but it's cool because you have me to explain where the bias is, right? So, sectional tensions over slavery in the United States have been building for decades. By 1854, when Congress's passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act opened territory that had previously been closed to slavery according to the Missouri Compromise. Opposition to the act led to the formation of the Republican Party in 1854 and revived the failing political career of an Illinois lawyer named Abraham Lincoln, who rose from obscurity to national prominence and claimed the Republican nomination for president in 1860. Lincoln personally hated slavery and considered it immoral. If the Negro is a man, why then my ancient faith teaches me that all men are created equal, and that there can be no moral right in connection with one man's making a slave of another, he said in a now famous speech in Peoria, Illinois, 1854. But Lincoln didn't believe the Constitution gave the federal government the power to abolish it in the states where it already existed, only to prevent its establishment to new western territories that would eventually become states. In his first inaugural address in early 1861, he declared that he had no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with slavery in the states where it exists. By that time, however, 7 southern states had already seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America and setting the stages for the Civil War. So, right there, you can already kind of tell that Abraham Lincoln, it was a very, like how liberals will dangle social issues in front of voters to get votes that they don't actually care about. This was like that, where Abraham Lincoln didn't actually care about black people. He didn't actually care about the plight of Africanized people here in the States. He just knew that he needed to do this in order to bring the seceded states into the Union. At the outset of that conflict, Lincoln insisted that the war was not about freeing enslaved people in the South, but about preserving the Union, see? For border slave states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, remained on the Union side, and many others in the North also opposed abolition. Just as an aside really quick, since we're talking about Maryland and slave states, the road that I grew up on, like the house that I lived in for 13 years, the street that was on was called Rolling Road. And the reason why it was called Rolling Road is because the slaves used to roll barrels of tobacco and commodities from the plantations in that area to Fells Point and to the Inner Harbor to be shipped off. I'm trying to find some. Here we go. Tobacco. And you can see here in this picture, this was the old method of getting tobacco to the market in the Inner Harbor and, Lexington Market and so on and so forth. And this is what the slaves used to do. The slaves would also, because slaves were considered cattle, the slaves would also do this instead of, beasts of burden, because slaves were considered beasts of burden. Before wheat and the flour mills flourished, tobacco was grown as a cash crop in Maryland, including the Howard district of Anne Arundel County, later Howard County. Tobacco depleted the soil and was more labor-intensive than wheat, but continued to be grown in some eastern parts of the state. A few roads have retained their original name. Rolling Road, nearby Catonsville, for example. Farmers compressed the dried tobacco leaves to thoroughly fill the hogshead specified weight, 1,000 or more pounds. So this was at least a ton of tobacco that they would have to roll from easily, like, I'm sure it'll say how many miles it is on here. Then those in the Howard district headed for Elkridge, according to Tyson. The old method of getting tobacco to market. The cask containing the weed was rolled to these warehouses on its own periphery. The rough farmers who had spent the whole season in cultivating a crop packed it tightly into a cask, then drove a long wooden spike into the center of each end of the compressed mass. This served as an axle tree. A split sapling was transformed into a pair of shafts. Rude tires were placed around each end of the cask, and a stout horse and a steer trundled this extempore wagon to the capital, Richmond, Virginia, where its contents were inspected and sold. Near each warehouse stood a furnace, into which all tobacco unfit for exportation was thrown to be burned. Rolling roads were also common and were opened for the transit of tobacco hogsheads by the planters who do not live on navigable streams, from their lands to Elkridge Landing and elsewhere. So Elkridge Landing was right on the other side of Rolling Road where I lived. In order to pass the tobacco hogsheads safely over the rolling roads, it was necessary that they should be made and hooped in the strongest manner. The tobacco, after being dried and stripped from the stems, was packed tightly in the hogsheads and headed up. These were then rolled over and over by 2 men to each hogshead to the place of shipment. They're leaving out the very crucial detail that this was done by slaves. The rolling roads were generally of a roundabout description from the necessity of avoiding hills, and though long out of use, could be distinctly traced on Elkridge after 1820. Several roads of this description are still distinguishable in Harford County. Wow. I am 88 years old, and I remember seeing tobacco prizes and tobacco barns in Maryland, and hogsheads barrels for packing tobacco and taking it to the steamboat landing over rolling roads for transport to manufacturing plants. So that's someone that actually remembers them doing this. That's pretty intense. That's from last year, too. So I just wanted to throw that out there as an aside, as more personal history for me, because the one of the main points I want to get across to people that watch the stream is that a lot of this stuff, when it's thought about or when it's talked about, it's very tempting because of the way that it's taught to us to think about it as ancient history. It happened however many years ago or whatever. But as stated in the comment section of that thread, there are people still alive today who remember this stuff. And also, aside from slavery continuing forward into history, into the modern day, in the form of the prison industrial complex, what you think of when you hear the word slavery, like chattel slavery, like people working on plantations and so on and so forth, was something that continued well after Juneteenth as well, even though it was illegal. It was just that you had this captive population of people who couldn't read or write and had nowhere to go. So you could have them on your property for generations. It continued into the 60s. Wild hearing about this is you're literally driving through Elkridge to pick something for your parents' place. Yeah. I mean, Elkridge, the history of that entire area, Elkridge, Lansdowne, Relay. The area that I grew up in was called Relay because it was the area where the first trains were established. And the early trains were not drawn by coal or by steam; they were drawn by horse. So you would have to switch the horses out in a relay, and that's why that place is called Relay. There's a lot of horse stables and stuff, like houses, horse stables that were converted into houses and so on and so forth. Um, it was a key fort in the Civil War called Fort Dix, which is nearby the Thomas Viaduct, which is the oldest stone train bridge that's still in use today in America. It's grim. Oh, bet. What's up, Mountain Roast? So I'm going to continue talking about the. Before I get too distracted, before I get too carried away, I'm going to continue talking about the Emancipation Proclamation, and then I'll get into Dix, spelled Dix. Um, I'll get into the history of the area where I grew up, and then I'll get into some of my family history, I guess. So, at the outset of the conflict, Lincoln insisted that the war was not about freeing enslaved. I already read that. I'm stupid. Yo, thanks for the follow, Earthling. When one of his generals, John C. Fremont, put Missouri under martial law, declaring that Confederate sympathizers would have their property seized and their enslaved people would be freed, the first Emancipation Proclamation of the war, Lincoln directed him to reverse that policy and later removed him from command. So, whenever Republicans or conservatives try to rub in your face about how Republicans freed the slaves and how Abraham Lincoln was, he was super gung ho and he truly cared about black people, remind them, first of all, about this. But I'm going to get to why Abraham Lincoln was kind of a piece of shit after I finish reading this. But hundreds of I'm going to also try to keep my language clean for this because I know it's supposed to be educational. But hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children were fleeing to Union-controlled areas in the South, such as Fortress Monroe in Virginia, where General Benjamin F. Butler had declared them contraband of war, defying the fugitive slave law mandating their return to their owners. Abolitionists argued that freeing enslaved people in the South would help the Union win the war, as enslaved labor was vital to the Confederate war effort. And that's also true. I have an ancestor who was a veteran in the Confederate Army. Naturally, the Negroes were not allowed to carry or use rifles in the war, right? But they would do things like carrying ammunition for the other soldiers, carrying supplies, corralling horses, basically being bullet spongers for the other Confederate soldiers. It wasn't until very, very late in the Civil War that the Confederate soldiers became so desperate that they actually allowed some of the black soldiers to carry rifles and train them in the usage of the musket and so on and so forth. Thank you for the donation, Earthling. I said at the top of the stream, also thank you as well, Jenna. I said at the top of the stream that I will be donating all the donations that I receive this stream to the Reginald F. Lewis Museum of African American History in Maryland here. So if you choose to donate to me tonight on this platform, you can do so at endlesscemetery.com. And anything you send to me there, I will be forwarding to that museum. And I also recommend if you're in the Maryland area, if you're in the Baltimore area, spend some money, spend some time, go check out the museum. You might learn something you didn't know before, especially about people like Frederick Douglass. Might learn some history about Inner Harbor and Pigtown and stuff like that, and World War II, all that stuff. It's very, very informative. What's up, Kuma? You found out last year your great grandfather is General Sherman? That's nuts. What area? So the museum is is downtown. It's at the Inner Harbor in Baltimore, the intersection of President and Pratt Street. I actually used to work in that exact area. I used to take the metro there, so I would take the train there to go to work every day. But Thank you, Darren Johnson. Shit was crazy, yeah. So let me go ahead and continue reading with this. And of course, this is also a discussion. By all means, if you have any questions that you want to ask, or if you have anything to contribute, I know Cran Raspberry mentioned earlier that a lot of the big prisons were built between 1865 and 1870. If you have any information like that to contribute, please, it's all appreciated. Um, I want this to be like a conversation, like a group discussion. You know what I mean? I'm sure it would be very boring to just sit here and watch me like Google stuff and talk to you guys anyway. So anyway, in July 1862, Congress passed the Militia Act, which allowed black men to serve in the U.S. Armed Forces as laborers, and the Confiscation Act, which mandated that enslaved people seized from Confederate supporters would be declared forever free. Lincoln also tried to get the border states to agree to gradual emancipation, including compensation to enslavers, with little success. When abolitionists criticized him for not coming out with a stronger emancipation policy, Lincoln replied that he valued saving the Union over all else, and that gets back to my earlier point. That sucks, Urameshi. It's all good, though. Yes. Oh, yes, absolutely, Jenna. Watch 13th. 13th is very important, and also watch High on the Hog. Both of these are extremely important things to watch. Just like bare minimum type things that are easy, and they're also not too heavy, because I know that for non-black people that this shit gets really heavy. Like, we are used to this shit because it's stuff that we have to be literally made aware of from birth, so that we understand the world that we move in and are cognizant of all the dangers around us. But if you're the type of person, if you're a person where like learning about racism or white supremacy has been like an optional side quest for you throughout your life, and recently you've decided that you want to get more informed, which is not, I'm not here to knock anyone or shame anyone. That's true about a lot of people. A lot of different people across the political spectrum have been becoming more aware of certain intricacies in the system that we live in over the past year, especially. But it can get really fucking heavy, especially with books like A Medical Apartheid that I mentioned, where you learn some very, very brutal and ugly shit about the country that you live in and the people in it and the leaders of it that are done to black women and well, I was going to say black people, but it's a Freudian slip, because I wanted to say especially black women, especially black trans people, and so on. The minority within the minority, if we're going to use that language, right? But my paramount objective in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery, he wrote in an editorial published in the Daily National Intelligencer in August 1862. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. So this is Abraham Lincoln basically just straight up admitting that he doesn't actually care about the fate and the plight of the Negro in America. He literally just wants to conquer these southern states and overtake them and have them contribute economically to the entire federal system, which is part of the reason why slavery was then state run. I'm forgetting the term right now, but it's like it's one of those things where when you're talking about communism, where industries are taken over by the state and then their economy becomes planned and run by the state. This happened, but with slavery, right? So this is what people who like are afraid of that type of stuff, like the downfall of capitalism, are afraid of, is that they're afraid of which is still capitalism. Excuse me, by the way. They're afraid of slavery becoming socialized, um, which happened. At the same time, however, Lincoln's cabinet was mulling over the document that would become the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln had written a draft in late July, and while some of his advisors supported it, others were anxious. William H. Seward, Lincoln's Secretary of State, urged the president to wait to announce emancipation until the Union won a significant victory on the battlefield, and Lincoln took his advice. On September 17, 1862, Union troops halted the advance of Confederate forces led by General Robert E. Lee near Sharpsburg, Maryland, in the Battle of Antietam. Days later, Lincoln went public with the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which called on all Confederate states to rejoin the Union within 100 days by January 1st, 1863, or their slaves would be declared thenceforward and forever free. So, just as an aside as well, Robert E. Lee in Southern States is like a fucking like Instagram celebrity for no reason. There was a dog park that I went to frequently with my dad as a kid that was called Robert E. Lee Park. I think it's called Roland Park now, if I'm not mistaken. But it's a dog park with a giant waterfall and stuff. There's monuments to Robert E. Lee throughout the city in certain places. So, yeah. And here you also have the compromise that Abraham Lincoln tried to make, where he was saying, if you join the Union, you get to keep your slaves. But if you want to secede, then your slaves will be considered freed. But it's kind of a moot point because obviously during this period of time, there weren't cell phones, there wasn't email, or there wasn't internet, anything like that. If you had any news, that news would take days, weeks, maybe years to get to wherever it needed to get. And with something like this, you would necessarily need a population of people to enforce this. And this is why you had soldiers who had to come through and actually physically free these people, because obviously the slave masters weren't going to be like, oh, sheesh, at midnight tomorrow, my slaves are free and I have no idea what I'm going to do, even though my slaves have no idea what the fuck any of is going on with any of this, right? They're completely oblivious. If I just kept doing the same thing tomorrow, they would have no idea, right? So that's what they did. That's why Juneteenth happened. Well, part of the reason why Juneteenth happened. On January 1st, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which included nothing about gradual emancipation, compensation for slavers, or black immigration and colonization, a policy Lincoln had supported in the past. And that's what I'm talking about there, and I'm going to get into that now, actually, since the article brought it up. Lincoln justified emancipation as a wartime measure and was careful to apply it only to the Confederate states currently in rebellion. Exempt from the proclamation were the 4 border slave states and all or parts of 3 Confederate states controlled by the Union Army. So I talked about this a little bit last stream. I'm going to bring it up here again because this article mentioned it in passing. There was a school of thought in America called the American Colonization Society. And what that essentially consisted of was Americans who believed that slavery needed to be abolished, right? It's basically what I'm about to say sounds very alt-rightish, right? Because the more things change, the more they stay the same. When you hear people who talk about white ethnostates, right? They talk about how even the most low-level jobs, essentially the lowest class in America, should even still be occupied by white people. White people can clean their own toilets and prepare their own food and do their own farming and so on and so forth, even though they cannot. Because if they did, they wouldn't need black and Latino farmers and so on and so forth to do that work for them. But the school of thought is that you would need to have that happen because that's the only way that you could have a truly white ethnostate. These people believe that America was for white people and only white people. So in the process of um, uh, civilizing the indigenous population, and of course by that we understand they were committing genocide, both culturally and literally, in terms of just straight up murdering the fuck out of all the indigenous people. But also, what they wanted to do was pack up all the black people, put them on a boat, and send them back to Africa so that they could have America just as a nice, clean, pure, whites only, white ethno state. And this is rhetoric that you'll hear from your white supremacists and white nationalists even today. They said that they could have peaceful deportation of all non-white citizens, right? So if you're Latino, if you're black, whatever, they believe that they can incentivize you to leave the place that you've spent your entire life so that they can have only white people in their vicinity, right? And this is the same thing that people back then believed, because by this point, black people had been enslaved in the country for 200 plus years, right? So I'll read this, and then I'll go back to the Emancipation Proclamation joint. The roots of the colonization movement date back to various plans first proposed in the 18th century. From the start, colonization of free blacks in Africa was an issue on which both whites and blacks were divided. Some blacks supported immigration because they thought that black Americans would never receive justice in the United States. Others believed African Americans should remain in the United States to fight against slavery and for full legal rights as American citizens. Some whites saw colonization as a way of ridding the nation of blacks, while others believed black Americans would be happier in Africa, where they could live free of racial discrimination. And that's the altruistic, the pseudo-altruistic viewpoint that white nationalists today have. They genuinely believe that people would be happier outside of America, where they grew up, back with their own people or whatever, because they believe that everyone functions under the same racial hierarchy bullshit that they do, where they think that their race is better than everyone else's race or something like that. Still, others believed black American colonists could play a central role in Christianizing and civilizing Africa. And that's one of the most nefarious parts, is that the same way you have people like Candace Owens, Thomas Sowell, Hodge twins, all these types of grifters, you would have African people who were heavily Christianized, heavily American conservative, go back and try to spread that bullshit to the people there. And we'll get into what happened because they actually tried this, and we'll get into what happened after they did it. Imagine your culture being so fragile that you can't handle having non-whites in society with you. I mean, that's unfortunately the truth of the matter. But the thing that's even more unfortunate than that is that they don't even understand how dependent they are on non-white people because of the consequences of the society that they've built. So all of the things that they consider low-level jobs, so like warehouse workers, truck drivers, custodians, farmers, in some cases, teachers, all these jobs that are considered expendable and non-skilled labor or whatever actually require an extreme amount of skill, first of all. But also, the country can't function without that shit. The country literally can't function without slavery either. That's why the federal prison system is the way that it is. Because the way that the country was set up is how it was perpetuated into the future, and it can't do anything differently than that, or else it would collapse, right? Capitalism thrives on cheap labor. Our society is built on cheap goods, and cheap goods cannot exist without cheap labor. And cheap labor is not going to be like the middle class, the bourgeois, the middle class, and upper class people are not going to do that cheap labor. That's all going to be lower class people, right? Lower class people do cheap labor, and cheap labor can only provide you with a lower class life. It's a vicious circle. It's feudalism by other means. Thank you for the host. The American Colonization Society was formed in 1817 to send free African Americans to Africa as an alternative to emancipation in the United States. So like I already said, instead of just freeing the blacks and having them live in the country, the idea was to just get them back on the boat and send them back to Africa, right? To go back to the store and ask to speak to the manager, right? These are the first Karens. In 1822, the society established on the west coast of Africa a colony that in 1847 became the independent nation of Liberia. By 1867, the society had sent more than 13,000 immigrants. So this is to this day the only American colony on the planet. Of course, if you don't consider Puerto Rico a colony, which free the Puerto Rican people. What's being done to the Puerto Rican people is fucking disgusting. And what's been done historically to them is fucking disgusting. You should read about Pedro Albizu Campos for sure, and his fight for the liberation of the Puerto Rican people. There's a book called War Against All Puerto Ricans that you should definitely read. I might get into that a little bit, but I'm not Puerto Rican. That's not my heritage. It falls under the purview of my understanding of how shitty American imperialism is. So I know about it on a surface level just because of my interest in that. But I am not particularly well versed in information about the interplay between the United States of America and Puerto Rico. So just wanted to throw that out there. But yes, Liberia is a colony, and they sent 13,000 black people there. Beginning in the 1830s, the society was harshly attacked by abolitionists who tried to discredit colonization as a slaveholder scheme. That's going to be important later. And after the Civil War, when many blacks wanted to go to Liberia, financial support for colonization had waned. During its later years, the society focused on educational and missionary efforts in Liberia rather than emigration. So what that means is they realized how much money it was actually going to cost to send all the black people back to Africa. So what they wanted to do is just go the indigenous people method, which is to just completely culturally destroy us and breed us out, I guess, to make it so that after a while, what they knew as black people wouldn't exist anymore, and it would just be white people or fair-skinned people and the things that those people believed, the WASP culture, right? Which is why it's extremely alarming when you hear people nowadays talk about why we shouldn't have Juneteenth as a holiday because we already have July 4th. That is essentially what they're doing. They're trying to erase all of the culture and history of the black people in this country, which is what's been historically done. That's why Black History Month even exists in the first place. It was originally Black History Week, and the reason why that existed is because they found out that the black children in the schools were not getting an appropriate education in terms of the history of what was done to black people in this country. And also black figures who were inventors and politicians and all that sort of thing in the country. In 1913, and at its dissolution in 1964, the society donated its records to the Library of Congress. The material contains a wealth of information about the foundation of the society, its role in establishing Liberia, efforts to manage and defend the colony, fundraising, recruitment of settlers, and the way in which black settlers built and led the new nation. So if you can imagine how Israel is today, that's pretty much how Liberia is with the indigenous African people of that area and the black settlers that were sent there or elected to go there from America. Moreover, opportunities exist for additional research on the collection. For example, map study could reveal new data about settlement patterns, land ownership, and community development in Liberia. Work on the photographs could lead to identification of more of the individuals, locations, and events depicted. From passenger lists and land grants, researchers could glean new knowledge about Liberian genealogy. And, although the early history of the society has been well presented in publications, the post-Civil War period has not been thoroughly examined. Paul Cuffey, a successful Quaker ship owner of African American and Native American ancestry, advocated settling freed American slaves in Africa. He gained support from the British government, free black leaders in the United States, and members of Congress for a plan to take immigrants to the British colony of Sierra Leone. Cuffey intended to make one voyage per year, taking settlers and bringing back valuable cargoes. In 1816, at his own expense, Captain Cuffey took 38 American blacks to Freetown, Sierra Leone, but his death in 1817 ended further ventures. However, Cuffey had reached a large audience with his pro-colonization arguments and laid the groundwork for later organizations such as the American Colonization Society. So, this was before the American Colonization Society. This was a man who was a black Indian who was saying, hey, why don't we take small numbers of people who can go back to this place and have their own customs and such, but be integrated more into the African society over there, which was very different from what ended up actually happening. Let me see if I can... Here we go. Yehudi Ashmun envisioned an American empire in Africa. During 1825 and 1826, Ashmun took steps to lease, annex, or buy tribal lands along the coast and on major rivers leading inland. Like his predecessor, Lieutenant Robert Stockton, who in 1821 persuaded African King Peter to sell Cape Montserrato by pointing a pistol at his head, Ashmun was prepared to use force to extend the colony's territory, and I think you see where I'm going with this. His aggressive actions quickly increased Liberia's power over its neighbors. In this treaty of May 1825, King Peter and other native kings agreed to sell land in return for 500 bars of tobacco, 3 barrels of rum, 5 casks of powder, 5 umbrellas, 10 iron posts, and 10 pair of shoes, among other items. So when you hear people talk about how, oh, black people sold other black people as slaves, remember that. Remember that the alternative in some of those cases was just a bullet in the head. Do you want to do business, or am I going to do your business for you? Let me see if I can find a history of Liberia video, just really quick. This should be an interesting video. It's about 8 minutes long. We can watch it really quick.
Settlement had its problems, including
I already started watching it. Whoops.
When looking at colonial maps of Africa, most of the continent was divided between the European powers, the only exceptions being the Ethiopians, who essentially fought off colonialization, and one other on the opposite side of the continent, Liberia. However, this nation is a remnant of pre-colonial times. It was the attempt of African colonization by the United States of America.
I'm going to grab a drink real quick. I'll be back.
The American Colonization Society was set up in December of 1816 by just elected President James Monroe, future President Andrew Jackson,
That's where Monrovia comes from,
politician Henry Clay, among others. The main goal was an establishment of a colony in Africa for free black Americans to go to. Some of the founding members viewed this as vital towards protecting slave property, while others and a good portion of the public supporters were abolitionists and never had much support in the Deep South. The organization raised around $50,000 in donation and membership fees from sympathizers during its first 10 years. But its biggest early source of income was the US government itself, where in 1819, Congress authorized a payment of $100,000 to the ACS. In 1920, the ACS sent its first colonists to West Africa, consisting of 91 people, 88 blacks, and 3 whites, on board a ship called the Elizabeth. They initially based themselves in the British colony of Sierra Leone before searching the coast for a place to establish their own settlement, where more than a quarter of the colonists died of yellow fever within 3 weeks. An agent of the ACS arranged to purchase an area of land called Cape Muzerado from the Gola people for the sum of $300. In January of 1820,
And like you heard me read earlier, it wasn't a simple transaction. It was pretty much done at gunpoint. So,
the first settlers arrived at the settlement. They initially called their settlement Perseverance, but in 1824 they renamed it Monrovia in honor of President James Monroe, who was a supporter of the ACS. The settlement had its problems, including several conflicts with the local inhabitants who resisted the expansion of the colony, but they did manage to thrive, which was aided by the immigration of over 2,500 African Americans over the next 20 years.
So he's kind of glossing over, it seems like, the brutal conflict that was the expansion of this colony in Africa. The indigenous people were not happy about this. They didn't want this. Like I said, it's kind of similar to how Israel is with their apartheid state today.
The success of Monrovia inspired the creation of several more American colonies in the region, such as the Maryland Colonization Society in 1831, funded by the state's taxpayers. Maryland
is going to come up a lot. It's a very strange state, very strange place with very strange history.
Appropriated $260,000 to be spent over 26 years to support the MSCS. Laws were also passed discriminating against free persons of color in Maryland in order to pressure them to emigrate. In February of 1834, the MSCS established its own colony in West Africa at Cape Palmas, 400 kilometers to the southeast of Monrovia. Its capital was named Harper City after a former U.S. Senator from Maryland. The colony itself was named the Republic of Maryland. The states of Louisiana and Mississippi also created their own settlement in Liberia at the mouth of the Sinai River. The movement was openly backed by the wealthy planters of the region as a way to reduce the number of African Americans in their states. However, only around 900 settlers actually left for West Africa. There were even New York and Pennsylvanian societies who set up the colony of Port Cresson in 1832. It was destroyed by the local Bassa people, but refounded 3 years later at Bassa Cove.
So the most liberal people of the time period also didn't want African people in their country. Remember that.
The supporters of this effort included many evangelical Christians and Quakers, and their motive was to spread the gospel to Africa by planting a Protestant settlement in the region.
Yo, thank you for the $10 donation.
The U.S. government had sponsored this colonization effort financially.
No problem.
And its warships and Marines offered their protection to the colonies when needed, but otherwise it took a hands-off approach and left their administration to the societies. Crucially, the settlements also had British goodwill. The main concern of the UK government in West Africa in this era was stamping out the slave trade, and the appearance of a free republic of ex-slaves in the region was a boost to the abolitionist cause. The colonists were almost all African Americans, but they brought with them the English language, Protestant religion, and Euro-American laws, customs, and attitudes to the natives who lived in West Africa. In 1838, the ACS colony of Monrovia united with the Quaker colony at Bassa Cove to form the Commonwealth of Liberia. Its population was 2,250, with 20 churches and 10 schools. A system of government was organized under the ACA back in the United States, and they appointed a governor with executive and judicial powers and a veto over legislation, but the colonists themselves would elect a legislative body. Thomas Buchanan, which was brother of a future U.S. president, was the first governor. After his death in 1841, the ACS appointed a local resident, Joseph Roberts, who became the first black head of government in Liberia. The colony of Mississippi in Africa agreed to join Liberia in 1842. However, the Maryland one was unwilling, and would remain separate until 1857. In 1846, the ACS urged Liberia to declare its independence, which it did the following year on July the 26th. There were two reasons for this. First, the ACS was nearing bankruptcy. The initial donation from the US government was long gone, and Congress was unwilling to advance more funds, while the colonization movement had never been as popular with the public as its founders had hoped, so donations were insufficient. Second, British merchants were complaining to their own government about attempts by the ACS to restrict or tax their trade with local African tribes along the coast. It was believed that if Liberia declared itself an independent sovereign state, it would be in a stronger position to resist British pressure to allow free trade. Liberia thus became an independent nation in 1847. This didn't stop the ACS from continuing its goal though, and even during the American Civil War, they sent roughly 200 to Africa, but the nation had a bit more to worry about at the time. However, the nation remained part of the US's sphere of influence, with a treaty under which the US government agreed to provide advice and assistance as required. American troops intervened in Liberia at least 5 times in the 19th and 20th centuries to prop up the colonial Liberian government against indigenous African resistance.
See what I told you? See why that was important?
Liberia's currency from its independence to 1907 was the Liberian dollar, which was pegged to the US dollar. Following the collapse of the economy in 1907, the country was threatened with a takeover by its creditors, but the United States preserved its independence. Following this and the start of the First World War, the United States started to take a more hands-off approach towards its former colony. And while the history of Liberia continues on even to this day, with many important events occurring within the nation, that will be a topic for another time. I hope you enjoyed the brief video about one of the more obscure aspects of history. If you have any topics that you'd like me to cover in the future, write them down.
You can't hear what they're saying.
Like
I have the volume turned down a little bit. I'll turn it up.
I have a link to my Patreon down
Is that
in
better?
the description, where you can pay for various benefits, and that
Sheesh. Uh-oh. This looks spicy. Let me see what's up with this. I turned the volume up so you can hear the other people a little bit better as well. So this is
much of the early history tended to focus and to dramatize the settler population, the settler population, leaving aside the fact that there was an indigenous population that lived here, that received them, that we tend to ignore the failures at assimilation. That provided some of the basis for what led to the coup d'etat and the subsequent wars. That cleavage that had not been addressed over time. Today it's very difficult because any percentage of so-called Americo-Liberians, numbers are so small that they have no means of doing it. And they themselves, everybody today is reaching for a common heritage and trying to find that common history, trying to find that common identity. That's what we're all searching for. And so it has been a long time problem, and we've paid the price for that, for the failure to address that over time.
Scared because they've lived in this country for years. Now they are being forced to go home. Nearly 36 Liberian natives live here in the Triad, but they and thousands of others across the country face a March 31st deadline for deportation.
Tonight they're appealing to President Obama and Congress to let them stay.
Margaret Johnson is live in our newsroom with tonight's big story at 6 o'clock. Margot.
Well, tonight we talk with one of the women on the list to be sent home, why she calls the situation unfair, plus the local efforts to change hearts in Washington.
It's been good, but now sort of disabled.
For 22 years, Vera Clark has called the Triad home. The 60-year-old Liberian native lives and goes to church in Winston-Salem, makes a living taking care of children in her home, a lifestyle now threatened as Vera faces a March 31st deadline for deportation.
It's not fair to have been here, paying your taxes, following the laws, and then be told you don't have a future here anymore.
She is among the thousands of Liberians the U.S. gave temporary protective status as civil war ravaged the African nation. Vera remembers barely making it out of the country alive with a gun pointed at her head.
And several times they had it cocked. It was with live ammo in it.
18 years later, conditions are starting to improve, and the American government is preparing to send the Liberians home. But they don't want to go. Many of them have families, jobs, and homes, and are sending money to their relatives in Africa who are struggling as the country tries to rebuild.
A lot of stress, and people on the phone calling. Have you heard anything yet?
The Liberians who are here are desperate.
Pressure from well-known people with clout may be their only hope.
I hope we can think better.
Please take a stand to keep families.
State Representative Larry Womble has even sent a letter to President Obama imploring him to let the Liberians stay, saying the country's infrastructure is nowhere near ready to handle an influx of that many people.
I've always been taught, it's an old axiom, in order to take a pig and make him into a hog, he has to be fed, he has to grow. And Liberia is just like a baby now.
Back at Vera Clark's house, she's asking America to remember what they have in common.
Liberia has been an ally of the United States for a long, long time.
In fact, they call themselves Americo-Liberians, freed slaves who left the U.S. and settled in Liberia, even naming their country after a U.S. president. So they believe the two sides have a strong connection. So the Liberians are asking the community to call your representatives in Washington and tell them you want them to stay. Back to you.
So there's that. Let's check this out. This looks interesting.
The American Colonization Society that started in 1816 had the idea that they would free some slaves and have them shipped out of the country. At first, well, they thought about the Western Territories or they thought about the West Indies, but mainly they were focused on shipping people to West Africa. And in fact, eventually they did begin a colony in Liberia. The colony of Liberia was started by the American Colonization Society people. Some very prominent white politicians were involved in the beginning of that organization, and some others. Francis Scott Key, for example, was one of the founders of the American Colonization Society. Now, they were very much the conservative branch of anti-slavery. Others thought it should be gradually abolished, and that was the tactic that a lot of the northern states took at the time of the Revolutionary War, right after the Revolution. And that meant eventually slavery would die out. The New England states, primarily at the Revolution, immediately abolished slavery. And the most militant, the Garrisonians, were immediatists. They thought slavery should just be done away with today, as soon as possible. And that was all that would have to be taken care of. Now, some thought that you would have to provide education. Others thought that it would be important to provide other kinds of aid. There was even one Southern planter, Robert Carter, who freed his slaves at the time of the Revolution, 500 slaves, and sent them to Ohio and provided education for them and housing. So he wasn't exactly anti-slavery, but I guess he was. He wasn't in part of the organized anti-slavery movement, but he certainly believed in freedom for slaves and thought that it was incompatible with the principles of the American Revolution. So there was a wide spectrum of opinion about how easily ex-slaves, black people, could be integrated
Nah, Taryn, not
into
tonight.
society. The most militant abolitionists thought that all you had to do was free people and they could make their own way in the society.
So there's that. I'll watch this just because it seems apropos.
Support came from people such as Tom.
Excuse me. I can already tell this is probably going to be terrible.
The American Colonization Society was founded by Robert Finley in 1816. Finley was born in Princeton, New Jersey in 1772 to his father James Finley and his mother Anne Angrist. At the age of 15, Finley graduated from the College of New Jersey, which is now known as Princeton University. It was founded to satisfy two groups. One group was for free African Americans and wanted to give them the opportunity to go back to Africa, and the other one was against free African Americans who feared them. The first meeting held by Robert Finley was in New Jersey. Even though the first meeting was held in New Jersey, a lot of the meetings were held in Virginia by politicians such as Charles Mercer, Congressman Henry Clay of Kentucky, Francis Key, and Congressman John Randolph.
Francis Scott Key.
The first president was Bushrod Washington, who was the nephew of George Washington. Other support came from people such as Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. They used their influence to gain public funding as well. Majority of the society consisted of evangelicals and Quakers who supported abolition. One of the biggest supporters of the society was Henry Clay, who was an American lawyer and politician who represented Kentucky in both the United States Senate and the House of Representatives. He served 3 non-consecutive terms as the Speaker of House of Representatives and was also the Secretary of State from 1825 to 1829. At this time, 2 million African Americans lived in the United States, and about 200,000 of those were free. The American Colonization Society decided to sell membership certificates, and the members pressured Congress and the President for support. Without the support of big-name guys like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe, the society would have never took off and accomplished the things that it did.
Yeah, so this is pretty terrible. I'm just going to keep
on January 20th.
Because now I'm getting into goofy stuff like this. Let's see if this is any better.
Hi, my name is Jesse Terkipego, and I'm about to give a presentation on the American Colonization Society. The American Colonization Society, founded in 1816, was made to assist free black people in immigrating to Africa. This was the brainchild of Reverend Robert Finley, a Presbyterian minister from Basking Ridge, New Jersey. According to the Library of Congress, Robert Finley was born in 772 in Princeton, New Jersey. He was a man of great intelligence, as he graduated from Princeton University at the age of 15. He worked as a teacher and he taught theology in several places, including Charleston, South Carolina, where many slaves existed. He then became a licensed minister in 1794, and in 1795 he was ordained as a pastor of the Presbyterian Church at Basking Ridge, where he served for 20 years as a popular preacher and noted educator, and he also originated the concept of the modern Sunday school curriculum. Prior to the formation, who wished to remain at $111.
Okay. And this is probably not great either. So I cannot stress enough that the American Colonization Society was not good for Black Americans or for indigenous Africans in the state of Liberia. It started off with good intentions, but the road to perdition is paved with good intentions. it essentially became another tool for the United States to expand its influence in the global sphere, and became another colony, just another colony. So, as Lincoln's decree applied only to territory outside the realm of his control, the Emancipation Proclamation had little actual effect on freeing any of the nation's enslaved people, but its symbolic power was enormous as it announced freedom for enslaved people as one of the North's war aims, alongside preserving the Union itself. It also had practical effects. Nations like Britain and France, which had previously considered supporting the Confederacy to expand their power and influence, backed off due to their steadfast opposition to slavery. Black Americans were permitted to serve in the Union Army for the first time, and nearly 200,000 would do so by the end of the war. I'm also going to talk about Fort Pillow, because that's also very important. Finally, the Emancipation Proclamation paved the way for the permanent abolition of slavery in the United States. As Lincoln and his allies in Congress realized emancipation would have no constitutional basis after the war ended, they soon began working to enact a constitutional amendment abolishing slavery. By the end of January 1865, both houses of Congress had passed the 13th Amendment, and it was ratified that December. It is my greatest and most enduring contribution to the history of the war, Lincoln said of emancipation in February 1865, 2 months before his assassination. It is, in fact, the central act of my administration and the great event of the 19th century. So, let's talk about Fort Pillow. Has anybody heard of Fort Pillow before? Anybody in chat? Have you heard of Fort Pillow before? Is anyone still in here? Anyone still active? You've never heard of Fort Pillow, you're Meshi. Okay, so Fort Pillow is very important. Fort Pillow happened during the Civil War. Happened in 1864. Let me bring this over for you all. It's all good, Kuma. It's cool. The Battle of Fort Pillow, also known as the... You've never heard of it, Earthling? Okay. You never heard of it, Cranberry? Bet. Okay. I'm just going to talk about it because it doesn't seem like a lot of people have heard of this, which is important. The Battle of Fort Pillow, also known as the Fort Pillow Massacre, was fought on April 12, 1864 at Fort Pillow on the Mississippi River in Henning, Tennessee, during the American Civil War. The battle ended with a massacre of Union soldiers, many of them African Americans, attempting to surrender by soldiers under the command of Confederate Major General Nathan Bedford Forrest. Who's heard the name Nathan Bedford Forrest before? Do you know who Nathan Bedford Forrest is? No Googling, that's cheating. It's cool. I'll just say. So Nathan Bedford Forrest founded the KKK. Yes. Yep. Cran Raspberry, you got it. Yep. Nathan Bedford Forrest founded the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. I'll talk about him in a minute. Actually, I'll just get into him really quick. Nathan Bedford Forrest was a prominent Confederate Army general during the American Civil War and the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan from 1867 to 1869. He is a wealthy cotton plantation owner, horse and cattle trader, real estate broker, and slave trader. Because Forrest Gump, that's funny. Military historian David J. Eicher concluded Fort Pillow marked one of the bleakest, saddest events of American military history. They call themselves wizards. They have all kinds of names for themselves. I'll get into the KKK after this, Yurmeshi, if you're curious about it. Because they have to make it seem mysterious and magical and stuff. You have wizards, you have dragons, you have cyclopses, you have nighthawks, just all these hilarious names, like straight out of D&D. So let's talk about Fort Pillow. The deployment of black men as U.S. soldiers by the Union, combined with Abraham Lincoln's issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation, profoundly angered the Confederates, who called it uncivilized. So they're talking about white people and black people living together. That's all they're talking about. If black people aren't in slavery, that's uncivilized, right? In response, the Confederacy in May 1863 passed a law stating that black U.S. soldiers captured while fighting against the Confederacy will be turned over to the state where the captured will be tried according to state laws. Fort Pillow on the Mississippi River, 40 miles north of Memphis, was built by Confederate Brigadier General Gideon Johnson Pillow in early 1862 and was used by both sides during the war. With the fall of New Madrid and Island No. 10 to Union forces, Confederate troops evacuated Fort Pillow on June 4th in order to avoid being cut off from the rest of the Confederate Army. Union forces occupied Fort Pillow on June 6th and used it to protect the river approach to Memphis. The fort stood on a high bluff and was protected by 3 lines of entrenchments arranged in a semicircle, with a protective parapet 4 feet thick and 6 to 8 feet high surrounded by a ditch. During the battle, this design proved to be a disadvantage to the defenders because they could not fire upon approaching troops without mounting the top of the parapet, which subjected them to enemy fire. Because of the width of the parapet, operators of the 6 artillery pieces of the fort found it difficult to depress their barrels enough to fire on the attackers once they got close. A Union gunboat, the USS New Era, commanded by Captain James Marshall, was also available for the defense. On March 16, 1864, Major General Nathan Bedford Forrest launched a month-long cavalry raid with 7,000 troopers into West Tennessee and Kentucky. Their objectives were to capture Union prisoners and supplies and to demolish posts and fortifications from Paducah, Kentucky, south to Memphis. Forrest's Cavalry Corps, which he called the Cavalry Department of West Tennessee and North Mississippi, consisted of the divisions led by Brigadier Generals James R. Chalmers, brigades of Brigadier General Robert V. Richardson and Colonel Robert M. McCullough, and General A. Buford, brigades of Colonels Tyree H. Bell and A. P. Thompson. The first of the 2 significant engagements in the expedition was the Battle of Paducah on March 25th, where Forrest's men did considerable damage to the town and its military supplies. Forrest had tried to bluff U.S. Colonel Stephen G. Hicks into surrender, warning, "If I have to storm your works, you may expect no quarter." Hicks rejected the demand as he knew that the fort could not be easily taken. Numerous skirmishes occurred throughout the region in late March and early April. That no quarter statement is going to be important later. Needing supplies, Forrest planned to move on Fort Pillow with about 1,500 to 2,500 men. He had detached part of his command under Buford to strike Paducah again. He wrote on April 4th, "There is a federal force of 500 to 600 at Fort Pillow, which I shall attend to in a day or 2, as they have horses and supplies which we need." The Union garrison at Fort Pillow consisted of about 600 men divided almost evenly between black and white troops. The black soldiers belonged to the 6th U.S. Regiment Colored Heavy Artillery and a section of the 2nd Colored Light Artillery, previously known as the Memphis Battery Light Artillery, African descent, under the overall command of Major Lionel F. Booth, who had been in the fort for only 2 weeks. Booth had been ordered to move his regiment from Memphis to Fort Pillow on March 28th to augment the cavalry who had occupied the fort several weeks earlier. Many of the regiment were former slaves who understood the personal cost of a loss to the Confederates, at best an immediate return to slavery rather than being treated as a prisoner of war. They had heard that some Confederates threatened to kill any black Union troops they encountered. The white soldiers were predominantly new recruits from Bradford's battalion, a Union unit from West Tennessee commanded by Major William F. Bradford. So to set the stage, this fort was pretty much occupied half and half by black troops who were, a lot of them were former slaves, right? So they had vested interest in fighting the Confederacy. And the other half was all white FNGs. Right, so they was all pretty much people who were new to military and to warfare, like to military life and warfare. Which isn't to say that they were unprepared for any of this stuff. It's just to say that they were not veteran troops here at this fort. So let's get into what actually happened there. Forrest arrived at Fort Pillow at 10 on April 12th. By this time, Chalmers had already surrounded the fort. A stray bullet struck Forrest's horse, felling the general and bruising him. This was the first of 3 horses he lost that day. He deployed sharpshooters around the higher ground that overlooked the fort, bringing many of the occupants into their direct line of fire. Major Booth was killed by a sharpshooter's bullet to the chest, and Bradford assumed command. By 11, the Confederates had captured 2 rows of barracks about 150 yards from the southern end of the fort. The Union soldiers had failed to destroy these buildings before the Confederates occupied them, and they subjected the garrison to a murderous fire. Rifle and artillery fire continued until 3:30, when Forrest sent a note demanding surrender. The conduct of the officers and men garrisoning Fort Pillow has been such as to entitle them to being treated as prisoners of war. I demand the unconditional surrender of the entire garrison, promising that you shall be treated as prisoners of war. My men have just received a fresh supply of ammunition, and from their present position can easily assault and capture the fort. Should my demand be refused, I cannot be responsible for the fate of your command. So, already he's basically saying, give up and we'll just treat you like prisoners of war. But if we have to keep fighting you, then I can't guarantee you that your safety is going to be assured. Bradford replied, concealing his identity as he did not wish the Confederates to realize that Booth had been killed, requesting an hour for consideration. Forrest, who believed that reinforcing troops would soon arrive by river, replied that he would only allow 20 minutes and that if at that expiration of that time the fort is not surrendered, I shall assault it. Bradford refused this opportunity with a final reply, I will not surrender. Forrest then ordered his bugler to sound the charge. Bugler to sound the cheese. Oh my god. Please, oh my god. A bugler. Oh my god. I'm sorry. Forrest then ordered his bugler to sound the charge. The Confederate assault was furious. While the sharpshooters maintained their fire into the fort, a first wave entered the ditch and stood while the second wave used their backs as stepping stones. These men then reached down and helped the first wave scramble up a ledge on the embankment. All of this proceeded flawlessly and with very little firing except from the sharpshooters and around the flanks. Thank you for the like, Jesus. Their fire against the new era caused the sailors to button up their gun ports and hold their fire. As the sharpshooters were signaled to hold their fire, the men on the ledge went up and over the embankment, firing now for the first time into the masked defenders. The garrison fought briefly, but then broke and ran to the landing at the foot of the bluff, where they had been told that the Union gunboat would cover their withdrawal by firing grape shot and canister rounds. Because its gun ports remained sealed, the gunboat did not fire a single shot. The fleeing soldiers were subjected to fire both from the rear and from the flank. Many were shot down. Others reached the river only to drown or be picked off in the water by marksmen on the bluff. So these are people who were retreating and who were being shot in the back by Confederate soldiers. Just so you understand what's happening here. So let's get into the massacre. After the battle, a large number of African American soldiers were massacred in one of the most controversial events of the war. Though most of the Union garrison surrendered and thus should have been taken as prisoners of war, the soldiers were killed. The Confederate refusal to treat these troops as traditional prisoners of war infuriated the North and led to the Union's refusal to participate in prisoner exchanges. So, if you were ever wondering why that never happened, this is why. Although Confederate sources say that Forrest's forces kept firing in self-defense, some historians and official Union reports emphasize that a deliberate massacre took place. So, like when they tell you that the Civil War wasn't fought over slavery, even though it was, the people who support this will say that the people shot these people while they were retreating in the back in self-defense, but it's not the case. Union survivors claim that even though all their troops surrendered, Forrest's men massacred some in cold blood. Surviving members of the garrison said that most of their men surrendered and threw down their arms only to be shot or bayoneted by the attackers, who repeatedly shouted, "No quarter, no quarter." Remember I said that no quarter statement will be important later. It was reported that women and children were killed, but this was disputed by Dr. C. Fitch, who was surgeon of the Fort Pillow garrison. Early in the morning, all the women and all of the non-combatants were ordered onto some barges and were towed by a gunboat up the river to an island before anyone was hurt. This is supported by the testimony of Captain Marshall. He stated that all the women, children, and sick soldiers were removed to an island before the battle started. The strongest evidence that the Confederates did not kill women and children is that no one reported seeing the bodies of women and children among the slain. The Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War immediately investigated the incident, which was widely publicized in the Union press. Stories appeared April 16th in the New York Times, New York Herald, New York Tribune, Chicago Tribune, Cincinnati Gazette, and St. Louis, Missouri Democrat, based on telegraph reports from Cairo, Illinois, where the steamer Platte Valley, carrying survivors, had called so that they could be taken to a hospital at nearby Mound City, Illinois, and those that had expired on the ship could be buried. In their report, from which the previous quotes were taken, they concluded that the Confederates shot most of the garrison after it had surrendered. So not only are they shooting retreating soldiers in the back, they're shooting people who have already surrendered, that they had previously said would be treated like prisoners of war, and they're just executing them. A letter from one of Forrest's own sergeants, Achilles V. Clark, writing to his sisters on April 14th, reads in part, "Our men were so exasperated by the Yankees' threats of no quarter that they gave but little. The slaughter was awful. Words cannot describe the scene. The poor deluded Negroes would run up to our men, fall on their knees, and with uplifted hands scream for mercy, but they were ordered to their feet and then shot down. The white men fared but little better. The fort turned out to be a great slaughter pen. Blood, human blood, stood about in pools, and brains could have been gathered up in any quantity. I, with several others, tried to stop the butchery, and at one time had partially succeeded, but General Forrest ordered them shot down like dogs, and the carnage continued. Finally, our men became sick of blood, and the firing ceased." A 2002 study by Albert Castle concluded that Forrest's troops had killed a large number of the garrison after they had either ceased resisting or were incapable of resistance. Historian Andrew Ward in 2005 reached the conclusion that an atrocity in the modern sense occurred at Fort Pillow, but that the event was not premeditated nor officially sanctioned by Confederate commanders. Recent histories concur that a massacre occurred. Historian Richard Fuchs, the author of An Unerring Fire, concludes, "The affair at Fort Pillow was simply an orgy of death, a mass lynching to satisfy the basest of conduct, intentional murder for the vilest of reasons, racism and personal enmity." Ward states, "Whether the massacre was premeditated or spontaneous does not address the more fundamental question of whether a massacre took place. It certainly did in every dictionary sense of the word." John Simprich states, "The new paradigm in social attitudes and the fuller use of available evidence has favored a massacre interpretation. Debate over the memory of this incident formed a part of sectional and racial conflicts for many years after the war, but the reinterpretation of the event during the last 30 years offers some hope that society can move beyond past intolerance." Lieutenant Daniel Van Horn of the 6th U.S. Heavy Artillery, Colored, stated in his official report, "There never was a surrender of the fort, both officers and men declaring they never would surrender or ask for quarter. Another officer of the unit, however, and the only surviving officers of Bradford's battalion, attested to the characterization that unarmed soldiers were killed in the act of surrendering. Confederate Sergeant Clark, in a letter written home shortly after the battle, said that the poor deluded Negroes would run up to our men, fall upon their knees, and with uplifted hand scream for mercy, but were ordered to their feet and then shot down. This account is consistent with the relatively high comparative casualties sustained by race of the defenders." Finna mug all night. I feel that, you're meshy. Forrest's men insisted that the Union soldiers, although fleeing, kept their weapons and frequently turned to shoot, forcing the Confederates to keep firing in self-defense. I don't know if you understand, first of all, how hard a musket is to fire running, but to turn around and fire it while you're running is, yeah. Their claim is consistent with the discovery of numerous Union rifles on the bluffs near the river. The Union flag was still flying over the fort, which indicated that the force had not formally surrendered. A contemporary newspaper account from Jackson, Tennessee states that General Forrest begged them to surrender, but not the first sign of surrender was ever given. Similar accounts were reported in both southern and northern newspapers at the time. Historian Alan Nevins wrote that although the interpretation of the facts had provoked some disputation, Northerners, however, saw only one side. They read headlines announcing attack on Fort Pillow, indiscriminate slaughter of the prisoners, shocking scenes of savagery, dispatches from Sherman's army declaring there is a general gritting of teeth here, reports from Missouri Democrat detailing the fiendishness of rebel behavior, and editorials like that in the Chicago Tribune condemning the murder and butchery. Oh no, Algal, my pal. This is a special stream. This is a Juneteenth stream. I'm going to be doing like Civil War, African American history and stuff all night into Juneteenth. The blacks and their officers were shot down, bayoneted, and put to the sword in cold blood. Out of 400 Negro soldiers, only about 20 survive. At least 300 of them were destroyed after the surrender. This is the statement of the rebel General Chalmers himself to our informant. That's what the New York Times reported on April 24th. Forrest's dispatch stated, "The river was dyed with the blood of the slaughtered for 200 yards. The approximate loss was upward of 500 killed, but few of the officers escaping. My loss was about 20 killed. It is hoped that these facts will demonstrate to the Northern people that Negro soldiers cannot cope with Southerners." It's all good, Algal, my pal. Yeah, tomorrow is Juneteenth, but I'm doing a stream tonight. I might do another stream tomorrow. I'm thinking I'm probably going to end up doing another stream tomorrow, but we'll see. General Ulysses S. Grant quoted Forrest's dispatch in his personal memoirs and commented, "Subsequently, Forrest made a report in which he left out the part which shocks humanity to read." John Fisher, in his book They Rode with Forrest in Wheeler, wrote, "Grant refers here to two reports from Forrest to his superior officer, Leonidas Polk. A hasty, exuberant report dated April 15, 1864, dashed off 3 days after the attack on Fort Pillow, describing the success of Forrest's recent operations in West Tennessee, and two, a well-defined, detailed, and comprehensive report of the action at Fort Pillow, only dated April 26th. At the time of the massacre, General Grant was no longer in Tennessee, but had transferred to the east to command all Union troops. Major General William Tecumseh Sherman, commander of the Military Division of the Mississippi, which included Tennessee, wrote, "The massacre at Fort Pillow occurred April 12, 1864, and has been the subject of congressional inquiry. No doubt Forrest's men acted like a set of barbarians, shooting down the helpless Negro garrison after the fort was in their possession. But I am told that Forrest personally disclaims any active participation in the assault and that he stopped the firing as soon as he could. I also take it for granted that Forrest did not lead the assault in person and consequently that he was to the rear, out of sight if not of hearing at the time, and I was told by hundreds of our men who were at various times prisoners in Forrest's possession that he was usually very kind to them. He had a desperate set of fellows under him, and at that very time there is no doubt the feeling of the Southern people was fearfully savage on this very point of our making soldiers out of their late slaves, and Forrest may have shared the feeling." Let's see if I can find anything on like YouTube about this. Let's see if I can find any stories about it. I have something from it. I hope I don't get my stream blamed for this, but we'll see. I don't care. This is important.
The consequences of the battle were not fully played out as Sherman felt no need to seek retribution. at the completion of the hearing. After the Civil War ended, the South was in serious trouble as Confederate money was worth nothing. Tennessee Governor Brownlow angered the Confederates by placing blacks in power. Black Union soldiers were allowed to govern over their former masters, which inflamed the growing hatred even more. This radical Northern action would only fuel the need for an organization for Southerners to feel like they were safe and had control of their communities again. This organization would be a fraternal organization of men, the Ku Klux Klan. The Invisible Knights of the Ku Klux Klan was formed in December of 1865 in the law office of Judge Thomas M. Jones. They formed this organization in Giles County in Pulaski, Tennessee. General Forrest was asked to lead the Ku Klux Klan by Captain Morton, one of Forrest's artillery officers during the war. General Forrest and other responsible leaders in the Klan, which at the time included more than a dozen Confederate generals. These men met with Brownlow's committee in 1868 to head off an inevitable bloodbath. The KKK was not the only organization of this sort. There were many other organizations in the South trying to prevent the Negro population from voting. The White Camellia, the Pale-Face League, the Shotgun Club, and the Council on Safety. But of course, the most ominous was the KKK.
The Klan of the 1860s can be compared with the Sons of Liberty. And it can also be compared with the Black Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and 60s. Because blacks then violated a lot of Southern laws that had not at that time been declared unconstitutional. And blacks then wanted to enroll every black they possibly could to vote. They wanted the right to vote. The Ku Klux Klan and Forrest wanted the ex-Confederates to also have their civil rights.
He's a part of our history which we can't deny. It's much as slavery. We can't deny it or overlook it and neglect it. We have to use it and grow from it. He's not a person I would think would want to have had dinner with me or would have enjoyed spending an evening with me. But I certainly can learn from the egregious errors that he made, in many ways, the egregious errors that men of his time might have made.
This just got so fucking weird.
One of the radical actions that the Klan made against black prisoners was they stormed jails, dragged Negroes out, and lynched them. They cut out their hearts and fed them to the dogs. These sort of barbaric actions forced Forrest to disband the Klan in 1869. When Forrest disbanded the Klan, he ordered the members to burn their garments. You would think this was the end of the Klan.
Nope.
45 years later, we couldn't have been more wrong. The premiere of D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation in 1915 brought the Klan to light again. By 1924, the Invisible Empire had reached 4 million members. Only the direction or motives of the men were now directed toward non-whites, Jews, Catholics, and foreigners. The Klan virtually disappeared prior to World War II, but it became more active after the Supreme Court decision to desegregate in 1954. In the year 1875, Forrest was asked to speak at a function in which Miss Lou Lewis presented Forrest with a bouquet of flowers and stated,
"Please allow me to present this bouquet of reconciliation and offering of peace and goodwill."
Miss Lewis, ladies and gentlemen, I accept these flowers as a token of reconciliation between the white and colored races of the South. This is a proud day for me, having occupied the position I have for 13 years and being misunderstood by the colored race. I take this occasion to say that I am your friend.
Forrest even made a contribution, a substantial contribution, to the erection of the Beale Street Baptist Church here in Memphis, which of course was one of the earlier black churches that were built here in Memphis.
I'm excited to hear and see members of my generation talk about a healing process between the races and genders. And
I would say Forrest, in the last few years of his life, had a more enlightened attitude toward the black people than most other Southerners did.
The black people.
Now a major general, Forrest spent the first part of 1864 recruiting and resting. Forrest, like his fellow Southerners, was outraged about the news of a mass recruitment of black volunteers.
The majority of these soldiers were, in fact, former slaves. Slavery, of course, was the underlying or the underpinning element of the Southern economy. Consequently, it was incapable of financing the war. The other thing, of course, is that the presence of black Union Army soldiers helped to dispel the myth of white supremacy.
He first faced these freshly trained black...
I should also state that white supremacy was definitely alive and well at the time. As stated previously, Abraham Lincoln did not care about black people. He cared more about preserving the Union for economic purposes. He was one of the people before the Civil War that wanted to just put all the black people on a boat and send them back to Africa. Just like today, where liberals do not care about black people, because if you truly cared about black people, you would abolish the police, you would provide for adequate housing, medical care, food, all these things. You would not, the floor, rather, as it were, the floor, the absolute bottom of the barrel existence for black people and people in general in this country would not be where it is if anyone actually gave a single care, truly, altruistically, about any of these people. They're used solely as political footballs so that they can appeal to the more middle class people and the upper class people who vote and donate and give and have money.
Black soldiers with eagerness in their hearts to prove their worth while attacking a Union fort in Paducah, Kentucky. Forrest's command rode straight into the cannons of the 1st Kentucky Colored Heavy Artillery, containing 274 men, making up 1/3 of the federal soldiers stationed at the fort. They contained Forrest's troops and almost destroyed an entire Kentucky regiment. But the courage of the colored troops did not go unnoticed. The Union fort commander was very impressed by their actions against the invading Confederate army.
Allow me to remark that I have been one of those men who never had much confidence in colored troops fighting. But those doubts are now all removed, for they fought as bravely as any troops in the fort. Colonel Stephen Hicks, March 25th, 1864.
It was thought, of course, that black soldiers were incapable of adequately fighting off white troops who were in many instances somewhat better trained, but they had no less valor, if you will, in terms of fighting for the things with which they fought for.
Forrest and his men felt it was simply irritating to be repelled by such a force, especially after Hicks refused Forrest's terms of surrender.
I don't know. That doc was kind of weird. Make Dixie Great Again. Oh my goodness. I forgot what a cesspool YouTube is. But so yeah. All that stuff is happening. Let's talk about where Juneteenth happened and why that was important. Okay, so this is the Battle of Galveston. The Battle of Galveston was a naval and land battle of the American Civil War when Confederate forces under Major General John B. Magruder expelled occupying Union troops from the city of Galveston, Texas on January 1st, 1863. After the loss of the cutter Harriet Lane, the Union fleet commander William B. Renshaw blew up the stranded vessel USS Westfield to save it from falling into enemy hands. Union troops on shore thought the fleet was surrendering and laid down their arms. The battle is sometimes called the Second Battle of Galveston, as the Battle of Galveston Harbor, October 1862, is sometimes called the First Battle of Galveston. Two Confederate cottonclads, CS Bayou City and the CS Neptune, commanded by Leon Smith, sailed from Houston to Galveston in an effort to engage the Union fleet in Galveston Harbor, which consisted of the USS Clifton, USS Harriet Lane, USS Westfield, USS Owasco, USS Corypheus, and USS Sachem. Outnumbered 6-2 by the northern ships, Neptune was severely damaged by the Union fleet and eventually sank. While Neptune was quickly disabled, Bayou City succeeded in capturing USS Harriet Lane. During this time, USS Westfield was grounded on a sandbar. A 3-hour truce was called for by Magruder, but Union Fleet Commander William B. Renshaw, ignoring the negotiation offer, attempted to destroy the grounded Westfield with explosives rather than let it fall into enemy hands. Renshaw and several Union troops were subsequently killed when the explosives were set off too early. Union troops on shore were convinced that their own ships were surrendering and, therefore, laid down their arms. The remaining U.S. ships did not surrender and succeeded in retreating to Union-controlled New Orleans. The Union blockade around the city of Galveston was lifted temporarily for 4 days, and Galveston remained the only major port that remained in Confederate hands at the end of the war. The Confederate Congress stated this on the successful recapture in Galveston. The bold, intrepid, and gallant conduct of Major General J. Bankhead Magruder, Colonel Thomas Green, Major Leon Smith, and other officers, and of the Texan Rangers and soldiers engaged in the attack on and victory achieved over the land and naval forces of the enemy at Galveston on the 1st of January, 1863, eminently entitled them to the thanks of Congress and the country. This brilliant achievement resulting under the providence of God in the capture of the war steamer Harriet Lane and the defeat and ignominious flight of the hostile fleet from the harbor, the recapture of the city, and the raising of the blockade of the port of Galveston signally evinces that superior force may be overcome by skillful conception and daring courage. So this was the climate of the time of the area where Juneteenth was happening. There's a port city. As stated previously, the Confederate, can't even imagine those comments. Yeah. The Confederate economy was almost entirely dependent on slavery. So that is why they hung on to it for so long and so desperately in this area, because it was the only place where the Confederacy could make any money. The other areas were pretty much war-torn. So, and you have to imagine it's a port city, right? So people definitely would have heard of the Emancipation Proclamation, right? It's not as if the order didn't get to Galveston until 1865, right? Or excuse me, it was 1865, I'm sorry. '66. I'm sorry, 1860. Why am I like this? $1865, yes. Okay, so it was 1865. I'm tripping. So, actually, you know what? I'm just gonna go ahead and, because I already read some Wikipedia. I'll read Wikipedia about Juneteenth. I'm not gonna read all of that because we've already talked so much about Juneteenth. What I will do is, I'll go to the end of slavery in Texas, which is kind of dovetail with what I was just talking about with the second battle of Galveston. So, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd, 1862. It became effective on January 1st, 1863, declaring that all enslaved persons in the Confederate States of America in rebellion and not in Union hands were freed. More isolated geographically, planters and other slaveholders have migrated into Texas from eastern states to escape the fighting, and many brought enslaved people with them, increasing by the thousands the enslaved population in the state at the end of the Civil War. Although most lived in rural areas, more than 1,000 resided in both Galveston and Houston by 1860, with several hundred in other large towns. By 1865, there were an estimated 250,000 enslaved people in Texas. Despite the surrender of General Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, the Western Army of the Trans-Mississippi did not surrender until June 2nd. On the morning of Monday, June 19, 1865, Union Major General Gordon Granger arrived on the island of Galveston, Texas, to take command of the more than 2,000 federal troops recently landed in the Department of Texas to enforce the emancipation of its slaves and oversee a peaceful transition of power, additionally nullifying all laws passed within Texas during the war by Confederate lawmakers. The Texas Historical Commission and Galveston Historical Foundation report that Granger's men marched throughout Galveston reading General Order No. 3 first at Union Army Headquarters at the Osterman Building, formerly at the intersection of Strand Street and 22nd Street since demolished, in the Strand Historic District. And next, they marched to the 1861 Customs House and Courthouse before finally marching to the Negro Church on Broadway, since renamed Reedy Chapel AME Church. The order informed all Texans that, in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves were free. The people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. So, basically, if we are viewing white supremacy as separate from slavery, or rather, slavery just being under the umbrella of white supremacy, what this is essentially saying is that the institution of slavery would no longer be continued. Rather, the slave owner and slave relationship would now become a employer and hired labor relationship. Which, if you've ever heard of the term wage slavery, it's slavery with extra steps. The people were still pretty oppressed, but they just the consequences were slightly reduced for their daily life. Long-standing urban legend places the historic reading of General Order No. 3 at Ashton Villa. However, no extant historical evidence supports such claims. On June 21st, 2014, the Galveston Historical Foundation and Texas Historical Commission erected a Juneteenth plaque where the Osterman building once stood, signifying the location of Major General Granger's Union headquarters and subsequent issuance of his general orders. Although this event has come to be celebrated as the end of slavery, emancipation for the remaining enslaved in 2 Union border states, Delaware and Kentucky, would not come until several months later. On December 18, 1865, when ratification of the 13th Amendment was announced, the freedom of formerly enslaved people in Texas was given state law status in a series of Texas Supreme Court decisions between 1868 and 1874. And let's talk about Jim Crow. Because, like I was saying, the relationship between whites and blacks in the country was almost completely unchanged in terms of the social hierarchy that existed in the country. The only thing that changed was now slavery was socialized. So you could not be a private owner of slaves. The only entity that could own slaves in the country from this point forward would be the state. So, therefore, it was illegal to just round up black people and hold them at gunpoint to make them work on your farm. However, what you could do is criminalize acts that black people performed. So things as simple as walking on the same sidewalk that a white person was walking on and not moving out of their way. You could be put into slavery for that because that would be considered a crime. You would be tried, arrested, convicted for it, and you were right back where you were before any of this was even done. And that's how the law still works today. Let me show you a picture really quick. So this is what prison looks like in Louisiana. Pretty nuts, right? This is from August 18th, 2011. A prison guard on horseback watches inmates return from a farm work detail at the Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola, Louisiana. So, yeah, this is what slavery turned into. This is what it was always meant to be, and this is the reason why the prison industrial complex continues to exist to this day. Because, like I said earlier, our society is dependent on cheap goods, and cheap goods require cheap labor. And most people don't want to perform cheap labor by choice. So, you use slavery. In the early 20th century, economic and political forces led to a decline in Juneteenth celebrations. From 1890 to 1908, Texas and all former Confederate states passed new constitutions or amendments that effectively disenfranchised black people, excluding them from the political process. White-dominated state legislatures passed Jim Crow laws imposing second-class status. Gladys L. Knight writes the decline in celebration was in part because upwardly mobile blacks were ashamed of their slave past and aspired to assimilate into mainstream culture. Younger generations of blacks, becoming further removed from slavery, were occupied with school and other pursuits. Others who migrated to the northern United States couldn't take time off or simply dropped the celebration. And that should sound familiar because that's a lot of liberal blacks today. A lot of the liberal blacks, what the fuck, you're messing? Yeah, that's what prison looks like now. Prison, when people say that the modern federal prison system is modern day slavery, that's literally what it is. Just it's this right here. Like I have Cran Raspberry said earlier in the stream that a lot of these big prisons were literally built in the direct aftermath of the Emancipation Proclamation, And Juneteenth, this is why, is because the United States literally cannot exist without slavery. It can't. It just can't. And that's why we say abolish the police, because I'll get into the history of the police in a minute. I'm going to finish up this Juneteenth shit first. Or rather, I'm going to finish talking about Jim Crow and how it relates to Juneteenth. I'm going to segue from this Jim Crow discussion into how the police function and what they are originally designed to do and how they function today and why it's necessary to abolish the police. The Great Depression forced many black people off farms and into the cities to find work. In these urban environments, African Americans had difficulty taking the day off to celebrate. From 1936 to 1951, the Texas State Fair served as a destination for celebrating the holiday, contributing to its revival. Excuse me. In 1936, an estimated 150,000 to 200,000 people joined the holiday celebration in Dallas. In 1938, Texas Governor James V. Allred issued a proclamation stating in part, whereas the Negroes in the state of Texas observe June 19th as the official day for the celebration of emancipation from slavery, and whereas June 19th, 1865 was the date when General Robert S. Granger, who had command of the military district of Texas, issued a proclamation notifying the Negroes of Texas that they were free, and whereas since that time, Texas Negroes have observed this day with suitable holiday ceremony, except during such years when the day comes on a Sunday, when the governor of the state is asked to proclaim the following day as the holiday for state observance by Negroes, and whereas June 19th, 1938, this year falls on Sunday, now therefore I, James V. Allred, governor of the state of Texas, do set aside and proclaim the day of June 20th, 1938 as the day for observance of Emancipation Day in Texas, and do urge all members of the Negro race in Texas to observe the day in a manner appropriate to its importance to them. 70,000 people attended a Juneteenth jamboree in 1951. From 1940 through 1970, in the second wave of the Great Migration, which my family was a part of, I can talk about that, more than 5 million black people left Texas, Louisiana, and other parts of the South for the North and West Coast. My family came from Mississippi and Alabama. As historian Isabel Wilkerson writes, the people from Texas took Juneteenth Day to Los Angeles, Oakland, Seattle, and other places they went. In 1945, Juneteenth was introduced in San Francisco by an immigrant from Texas, Wesley Johnson. During the 1950s and 1960s, the civil rights movement focused the attention of African Americans on expanding freedom and integrating. As a result, observations of the holiday declined again, though it was still celebrated in Texas. So, let's talk about the police, because we just finished talking about how in the aftermath of the slaves being freed, the local governments then started to enact Jim Crow. First it was the Black Codes, but then it was Jim Crow and so on and so forth. Matter of fact, let me just look up Jim Crow here so I can explain that to you. In January 1865, an amendment to the Constitution to abolish slavery in the United States was proposed by Congress, and on December 18, 1865, it was ratified as the 13th Amendment formally abolishing slavery. During the Reconstruction period of 1865 through 1877, federal laws provided civil rights protections in the U.S. South for freedmen, African Americans who had formerly been slaves, and the minority of black people who had been free before the war. In the 1870s, Democrats gradually regained power in the Southern legislatures after having used insurgent paramilitary groups such as the White League and the Red Shirts to disrupt Republican organizing, run Republican office holders out of town, and intimidate black people to suppress their voting. Extensive voter fraud was also used. Maybe this is the Democrat voter fraud people were talking about. In one instance, an outright coup or insurrection in coastal North Carolina led to the violent removal of democratically elected non-Democratic Party executive and representative officials who were either hunted down or hounded out. That was the Wilmington, North Carolina insurrection. That if you guys want to know about that, let me know and I can read about it, but I'm just going to skip it for now. Gubernatorial elections were close and had been disputed in Louisiana for years, with increasing violence against black people during campaigns from 1868 onward. In 1877, a compromise to gain Southern support in the presidential election, a corrupt bargain, resulted in the government's withdrawing the last of the federal troops from the South. White Democrats had regained political power in every Southern state. These Southern white Democratic Redeemer governments legislated Jim Crow laws, officially segregating black people from the white population. Jim Crow laws were a manifestation of authoritarian rule specifically directed at one racial group. Blacks were still elected to local offices throughout the 1880s in local areas with large black populations, but their voting was suppressed for state and national elections. Democrats passed laws to make voter registration and electoral rules more restrictive, with the result that political participation by most black people and many poor white people began to decrease. That should sound very familiar to you. Between 1890 and 1910, 10 of the 11 former Confederate states, starting with Mississippi, passed new constitutions or amendments that effectively disenfranchised most black people and tens of thousands of poor white people through a combination of poll taxes, literacy and comprehension tests, and residency and record-keeping requirements. Grandfather clauses temporarily permitted some illiterate white people to vote, but gave no relief to most black people. So, think about that when you hear about the more restrictive laws in places like Georgia that are designed to reduce the number of people who can vote. It's literally to disenfranchise blacks and poor whites. So there's that. I wonder if I want to talk about the black codes because that's pretty important too. So the black codes came about before the Emancipation Proclamation and applied to black freedmen. They were laws governing the conduct of African Americans, free and freed blacks. In 1832, James Kent wrote that in most of the United States there is distinction in respect to political privileges between free white persons and free colored persons of African blood, and in no part of the country do the latter, in point of fact, participate equally with the whites in the exercise of civil and political rights. Although black codes existed before the Civil War and many northern states had them, it was the southern U.S. states that codified such laws in everyday practice. The best known of them were passed in 1865 and 1866 by the southern states after the American Civil War in order to restrict African Americans' freedom and to compel them to work for low wages. That was Jim Crow. So let's talk about the role the police have. I'm gonna, you know what, I'll just search. See if this, okay. So, a slave catcher was a person employed to track down and return escaped slaves to their enslavers. The first slave catchers in the Americas were active in European colonies in the West Indies during the 16th century. In colonial Virginia and Carolina, slave catchers, as part of the slave patrol system, were recruited by Southern planters beginning in the 18th century to return fugitive slaves. The concept quickly spread to the rest of the 13 colonies. So let's look up slave patrol. Slave patrols, traditionally known as patrollers, paddy rollers, or paddy rollers, by enslaved persons of African descent, were organized groups of armed men who monitored and enforced discipline upon slaves in the antebellum U.S. southern states. The slave patrol's function was to police enslaved persons, especially those who escaped or were viewed as defiant. They also formed river patrols to prevent escape by boat. Policing the movements of black people, slave patrols were explicit in their design to empower the white population. They were first established in South Carolina in 1704, and the idea spread throughout the colonies before their use diminished following the Civil War in the 1860s. Let me see. Okay, so here's a quote from NPR. Patrols enforced what were called slave codes, laws which controlled almost every aspect of the lives of enslaved people. Slave patrols were explicit in their design to empower the entire white population, not just with police power, but with the duty to police the comings and goings and movements of black people. American Police, NPR. So, essentially, the modern day police are an imprint of the slave patrols of the past because they function the same exact way, right? You could have stop and frisk, which is a denial of people's rights, but the justification for that is that the black people that you're stopping and frisking are potentially criminals. So there is no functional difference. There's maybe a philosophical difference in the way that liberals are able to justify the existence of police and the function that they have in society now, because you can say things like, oh, who will solve murders, who protects the population, blah, 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 when everyone implicitly knows, whether they explicitly realize it or not, that the police do not exist to protect you. They exist to protect capital. If someone breaks into your house, the police do not get there within 5 minutes. But if you break into a 7-Eleven or a CVS or something like that, the police show up instantly, right? There is an insane number of completely untested and unchecked rape kits. There's an insane number of unsolved murders, right? The police just don't exist to protect you. I don't know how else to put it. If that was what they were there for, they would do a much better job of it. And if that is in fact what they exist for, they're obviously not doing a great job. So why should we continue to pay them for a job that they're not doing adequately, right? The reason for that is they fill the same role that the slave patrols did in ye days of old. You have a captive black population, whether you're talking about the slaves back then or you're talking about black people in the hood or the ghetto now, right? Where you're born into abject poverty, absolutely squalid conditions. You have no resources in your community, whether it's poor food quality, people don't have shoes, have poor access to running water, electricity, all these things, right? The conditions the actual material conditions that you exist under in these places is not dissimilar from those conditions back then, right? And the job of the police in those instances is, like I said before, the liberal will convince themselves, how you doing, stars and moons? The liberal will convince themselves that the police exist in those areas to prevent crime, when the police do not prevent crime. First of all, they respond to crime. When the crime happens, you call the police. The police patrol those areas not to be a deterrent to criminals, but to make sure that they're there when the crime happens to catch those criminals, right? Now, we've already established through the 13th Amendment that slavery was simply reserved as punishment for a crime, right? Therefore, the role of the police in the modern day is to just snatch up black people to take them to slavery. Are you guys following me? Is this difficult to understand? Because I feel like I'm maybe being a little bit wordy about it, a little bit obtuse. So to suffice it to say that the conditions that blacks live under now in certain areas is no different than the conditions that blacks lived under in the most racist and horrible periods of time in this nation's history, right? Like I said, in certain parts of the country, you have black folk living with no running water, no electricity. They don't have shoes. They're illiterate. Depending on the area that they live in Baltimore, we have a huge lead problem. So a lot of them are lead poisoned. And there are correlations between lead poisoning and propensity for violence among young black males, right? So you have these conditions, right? Back in the slavery days, you just had the blacks that were on their shacks in the shitty part of the plantation or whatever, and you would have the slave patrols encircle those areas to make sure that the blacks stayed in their place. They never left those areas, and to make sure that they were working. And any slaves that or any blacks that made it out of those areas or escaped those areas, you would snatch them up and take them and make sure they got back to work. It's the same thing now. You're in the hood. That's where you're supposed to be. That's where you belong. And the meritocracy, the myth of the meritocracy in the United States that people believe is completely destroyed by the fact that there are people born in those conditions that did absolutely nothing to deserve those conditions other than have a shitty spawn point, right? Your parents happen to be poor and in the hood. So now guess what? Your trajectory in life is dunzo, right? If you're a young black male born in the hood, you are fucked, right? Your options are so incredibly limited in comparison to whites, even in very close areas to that. But let alone like, and this is why liberals and like meritocratic and capitalist people are so silly, is because they genuinely believe that a lead poisoned young black male born in fucking Baltimore City, Maryland, to a single mother because his father is locked up for selling crack and his mother is a sex worker who he never sees because she has to do that to make money so that they can eat a couple of times a week, right? And then he goes out and sells drugs because he has to feed his siblings while his mother's away or whatever, right? That person has the same opportunities and the same trajectory in life as fucking Jeff Bezos's kids, right? The silliest imaginable fucking like if that person in the hood just works hard enough one day, he could be Bill Gates. It's the silliest imaginable worldview, but these people hold it without ever questioning it because, as I said previously, United States cannot exist without slavery. Capitalism is slavery. When you're talking about people who want more capitalism and they want less regulation, they're talking about bringing back private slavery. Because like I said earlier, the only thing that the 13th Amendment did was socialize slavery. You as a private entity or a private corporation cannot own slaves, and yet the state itself, through the prison industrial complex, can own slaves. And you as the taxpayer will pay taxes into that slave system to support and maintain it. And what you receive from that slavery system is cheap goods, things like paper towels, Dixie cups, all this cheap shit that you get that you don't even realize is made in jail a lot of the time. And that's why we say abolish the police. That's why we don't, the smart people, the anti-capitalist people, we don't want more black vice presidents and black CEOs and all this stuff is nonsense. If black capitalism was the solution to the problem, it would have been fixed ages ago. We wouldn't have had a Tulsa, right? We wouldn't have had a Wilmington. It's very clearly not the solution to the problem, because that's part of the reason why it's so difficult to have any steps forward, because the capitalistic bourgeois upper class, the overlords, the feudal vassals have convinced the lower class people that if they're white, they're in the same club, right? If you're in the trailer park, if you're a white person, if you're a fucking like white truck driver or a white coal miner or something like that, you will never have a seat at the table with the person who owns the mine, right? You will never, ever in your life, you, your kids, their kids, and their kids will never remotely be close to the people who own the trucking company that you drive for. And yet they will convince you that you are, because your skin is the same color. And because black people already exist in those abject conditions, you will convince yourself, hey, I'm a fucking homeless drug addict, but I'm white. At least I'm not black. And society will then push you above the black people, because that's the way society is geared, right? Is black people exist on the bottom rung. That's the one constant for this country, is that at the top you have, thank you for the follow, at the top you have the whites, at the bottom you have the blacks, and all in between is all of the other immigrants and all the other different ethnicities just trying not to be black, right? Just trying not to be black, because that's the worst possible thing that you could be in America. And that's why being white is such a nebulous concept. The only thing that's defined by being white is that you ain't black, right? You have Lithuanians, you have Ukrainians, Irish people, Germans, Italians, Polish people, all these people that were not considered white in the founding of this country. Originally, white people were just Anglo-Saxon Protestant people from the UK, from the United Kingdom, from Great Britain. And you can even talk about some of the things that Benjamin Franklin had to say about the swarthy people, talking about Germans, right? So as time went on and it became more and more necessary to repress the lower class people in the country to ensure that the aristocrats and the upper class would always maintain their place and their hold and their stranglehold on all the resources in society, they had to turn the lower classes against one another by convincing the people that had paler skin that they all had something in common, right? It's just like how you hear people talk about immigrants, Latino immigrants today. They took our jobs, all that shit, right? They think that a Latino coming here and doing their job, being exploited at an even greater extent than they are, doing their job for a less amount of money to them, the potential for that happen is a greater threat to them than their employer sending their job off to fucking Malaysia or Thailand or something like that, to where it can get done by a literal child slave for pennies on the dollar, right? And they see no issue with that because it happens away from them, out of sight, out of mind, and they have internalized themselves, this image of themselves as potentially one day being that employer, right? All Americans see themselves as temporarily inconvenienced millionaires, right? All these people in America that believe that they're just one bright idea away from their first $1 million, but not one missed paycheck away from living on the street. And so that's why these ideas about the police and so on and so forth continue. That's why you have liberal blacks. That's why you have people like Candace Owens, right? Hodge twins, like I was saying previously, is that part of it is shame in the history of Africans in this country, right? Because it's painful. It's extremely painful. I literally, me personally, I'll show it on stream in a minute, but I found my great-great-grandfather's price, his fucking price tag, what he was listed, the price to purchase him. You could buy another human being for the price of a Honda Civic. Found him in his slave owner's will after he died. This is my slave. This is how much money he was worth if you want to sell him, right? I'm leaving him to you. If you want to get rid of him, you want to get some money, this is how much you should charge for him. This human being, this person with a personality, with the full range of human emotions, with a family. This man is property. It is a beast of burden. You can just get rid of him. $20,000. Thank you, DC Metal Chris. I appreciate the donation. So that, in conjunction with the desire, which came out of that period of time where you will mistake conformity for safety, because that is what the more liberal whites will tell you, right? And I'm sure some of the black people, if there's black people in here, you've heard it before. I've heard it many times, that when I was growing up, because of the way I speak, you guys hear my accent. I don't have, I don't use AAVE typically. Because of the way I speak and the interests that I have, video games, stereotypical nerd stuff, things that you would not stereotypically associate with black people, because the idea in the general public of black people is thugs and hypersexualized, brutish savages, right? That I wasn't really black. I'm white on the inside. I'm an Oreo, right? All these things. Because the goal of the project of the United States of America's brand of capitalism is the extermination of black people, essentially. There's and people are reluctant to use this word, but it's accurate. It's genocide. It's straight up genocide, because it's being done here and it's also being done on the African continent. The police perform the same role. They encircle these areas where poor black people exist, impoverished black people, and they make sure that they never leave that area. Unless it's to snatch them up to get to sell them to a new plantation. Whether we're talking about Angola, Louisiana, or we're talking about Georgia, or any of these other southern states with these plantation prisons, right? And that's just, that imagery is just so that you understand the severity of the situation, because it's 2021, baby. It's modern times, right? We have whole new methods of enslaving and suppressing people and getting them to produce goods, right? So it's not always going to look like the plantation, but that's what the model is, right? So the liberal position of police reform, it's just like slavery reform, right? It's just like the 13th Amendment. It's always just to, Malcolm X talked about how they will give us everything but freedom. They'll give us all these symbolic gestures. They'll fucking black out, like Bank of America, prime example. Bank of America blacked out their fucking logo for Juneteenth in solidarity with the black people. Meanwhile, they fucking extract millions of dollars worth of wealth from the black community daily in the form of overdraft fees, right? Subprime mortgages or subprime loans, where they were giving these loans to people that they knew were going to be fucked up and put them in a crippling debt because they could sell the debt. And debt is another form of slavery, right? I have a lot of despair when I talk to people in the older generations who are not as radicalized, because you would think that after witnessing them being from the period of time where you had your Fred Hamptons, your Eddie Conways, your Malcolm X's, your Martin Luther Kings, and so on and so forth, they would understand how crucial the community aspect of things is, and they would understand what we as a people are fighting for. And by we as a people, I mean black people in America. And really, honestly, the entire African diaspora all around the world, because anti-blackness is global, right? But instead, just like with the African Colonization Society, to where you have the successful mental murder of these black people, the full get out has happened, where you have completely destroyed their attachment to any of their past culture or customs or history, anything like that. And I don't even mean things in abstract, like religions or languages, that sort of thing. I mean purely the desire to resist, the inborn instinct of all black and indigenous people to white supremacy, which is to resist in any way possible at all times. Where you have black people now who contribute to white supremacy and don't even realize it and don't even think about it, because of the way that our schooling system and the way that our society is set up to inform these people. So you have black people who believe that if you just vote hard enough, you know what I'm saying? Like, the reason why things are so fucked up for black people is because black people don't vote hard enough, right? And if we just got all black people to vote, then we could get the right slave master in that would treat us right and won't fucking whip us as hard, right? Not understanding that the goal is not to vote in the correct slave master. The goal is to destroy slavery. The goal is to overthrow. The goal is to go our own way and do our own thing. And it's not to say to form, I'm not a black nationalist by any means. Don't mistake what I'm saying. You guys are all here. Fucking a lot of my best friends are white. Fade Runner is one of my best friends. He's a white dude. I'm not talking about black separatism. What I'm talking about is how somehow, and I say somehow as if I don't know how this was accomplished, through the assassination of all the radical black leaders, the deportation or jailing of them, which is why I've lately been reading so much literature from, and that's where you find is a lot of these black anarchists and black communists were radicalized through their experiences in jail. Most older minorities that you've spoken with about racism, including your parents, either believe we just need more reform or have given up on the idea that we can affect change. Yeah, I mean, my parents are the same way. My mom is a police chaplain because she genuinely believes, like, I got into a pretty heated argument with my father about why we need the police and the police have to exist, not understanding that the conditions that contribute to what they think of as why the police need to exist are intentional, are very intentional, right? There's a reason why the hood, quote unquote, the ghetto has not changed in 300 fucking years. There's a reason for that. There's a reason why, even though we all know more than half the country wants to legalize marijuana, while there's still black people sitting in jail right now for weed, right? Your dad's also try to convince you that there are good cops. Oh, of course, everyone believes that, because you have to, they just don't, they're not capable of conceptualizing the fact that the entire system itself is designed to enslave and destroy black people, right? It's like talking about, and you can't even say this because everybody accuses you of indulging in hyperbole, even though it's the exact fucking same situation. But when you're talking about Nazis, right? Nazi Germany, I'm sure there were soldiers in the German military who could care less about Jewish people, right? Who probably liked Jewish people. But the fact that they were cogs in the machine, right? Because that's what you have to think of. You're not acting individually. The police is not a collection of individuals. The police is a machine itself with a goal, with an express purpose, with intent. And the people in that machine are all individual moving parts in the machine that performs a specific action, right? So it doesn't matter if you have a cop that does that pulls you over and doesn't write you a ticket. It doesn't matter that you have a cop that plays basketball with black kids, buys some black kids pairs of Nikes. When you literally have cops out there who refer to black people as plate lips and niggers and shoot them on sight. When you have a judicial system that sees black people as nothing more than raw materials, as nothing more than commodities, by which you can use them at your own disposal. The judicial system is not, they're thinking of it backwards, right? They're thinking, and I promise you, they think this way because it was said to me when I had my legal trouble, right? If you just mind your business and stay out of trouble, the police won't bother you. You won't have to worry about the legal system. While they're talking about that, you have your Philando Castiles, you have your Tamir Rices, you have your Trayvon Martins, right? And they'll pretend like those people are aberrations of the system when that shit is so fucking common. We have to talk about a new one of those people every year, every month, every week, right? And it never clicks for them. Maybe this shit is happening on purpose, right? Because that's not how the system works. The system views you as a criminal waiting to happen, right? That's why all of this fucking surveillance state bullshit exists, is because that has expanded. Not even, obviously, that's how capitalism works, but not even just black people anymore. Anybody in the lower class, right? Your phone is being monitored, your emails, all that shit. Your TV has a microphone in it, all of that shit, because they're just waiting for you to fuck up one time so they can come get you, throw your ass in jail, and you can work for pennies on the dollar. Because the alternative to that is you're going in the fucking hole. You want to work for 30 cents an hour, or you want to go to solitary confinement? Because those are your options when you're in prison. Elijah McClain, yes, Elijah McClain. Right. It's not about the individuals. It's about the occupation. Right. And for every good cop, right, you'll have a dozen bad cops, as if there's any type of like cops can be bad. Like cops just choose to be bad. Not like there's an entire culture within that system that produces those kinds of people, that attracts those kinds of people, right? There's a joke. How many good cops does it take to change a light bulb? I'll let you know when a good cop changes anything, because it doesn't fucking matter. Good cops, in fact, bad cops love good cops, because when good cops exist, they can drag them out as examples of why the cops need to continue to exist in the first place and do nothing but enable the bad cops, right? Let's talk about Michael A. Wood, because I'm on the subject of police now, and I want to keep it going. And he was a Baltimore City police officer. Some of you might have heard his name before. He kind of got some prominence a little bit about 5 years ago during the Freddie Gray, during the Baltimore uprising. But let's check this out.
This is Mike Wood. He joined the Baltimore Police Department in 2003 when he was 24, but retired last year with a shoulder injury, disillusioned and feeling as if he was hurting the people of Baltimore more than helping them. He's a friendly, outgoing, and charismatic guy.
Yes, absolutely, Earthling. They never finish the phrase. It's a bad apple, but the phrase is one bad apple spoils the whole bunch, right? And that's assuming that the whole fucking tree isn't poisonous to begin with, right? Even if we were just playing the bad apple game, the phrase is one bad apple spoils the whole bunch. Thank you, Earthling. But I'm going to keep this going.
I've been surprised since over the past month, he's gotten a lot of practice at being camera ready. After going on a Twitter rant in which he revealed a series of awful things that he saw his fellow officers do while on the job, he has become the go-to dissident in the law enforcement community for journalists everywhere, an informed critic with an inside view of a culture that has come under unprecedented scrutiny over the past year. For all the talking Mike has done since going public with his stories, I didn't feel like I had a clear understanding of what being a police officer in Baltimore was actually like for him, what the job had demanded, and how the culture of the Thin Blue Line had affected his thinking about the role of cops in the lives of Baltimore's least fortunate, most vulnerable residents. With a notebook full of questions, I headed down there and asked Mike to give me a tour of his old stomping grounds.
You just ran a red light.
Yeah, it happens. There's nobody here.
We drove through his different posts, starting with the Baltimore Police Academy, the place where new recruits go to train before they're sent out into the street.
You guys can see what it is. It's a refurbished, abandoned school. It's disgusting on the inside. Like, that's one thing that gets lost a lot, is how the officers are actually treated in Baltimore, and they are not treated good. Like, the Eastern District where I was would have literally sinks hanging off the wall.
He told me story after story that would leave anyone dumbfounded and angry.
The officer comes around the corner and just boots him in the face as hard as he can. He just turns and just smacks her, like, open God out, and threw the guy off the bike, picked up the guy's shoes, threw the guy's shoes onto the roof.
I had heard about some of this stuff already from Mike's Twitter feed. What I really wanted to understand was why it happened. How does this culture of contempt and violence towards black people take hold in a police department like Baltimore's? And how is it perpetuated,
this is 2015,
even after an entire year of police
in the
scandals being in
aftermath
the
of the Freddie
headlines?
Gray event, is the Baltimore uprising.
For a while, when you're infiltrating, you're still technically a trainee. You could have been fired at any moment. For the first year, you can get fired for anything. You're just in pencil. It was during that time period where, like, even if I would have spoken out, somebody could have just been like, well, you're fired, see you later. You can't, like, when you're in that probationary stage, you can't upset the apple cart at all. You're going to be gone if you do.
Could you just describe sort of what you learned about police culture during those early days?
Yeah, you don't learn about it. You hear the past stories, and you see when a cop does something wrong, you see the unions and you see the politicians stand up for the officer. You don't see anyone stand up for the citizen. They just become a statistic, a number that you're going after.
That us versus them attitude, I mean, I understand how it is reinforced by, you know, the rhetoric that comes out of police unions, for example. How does it manifest itself in interactions that police have with people, like, on a daily basis?
Right, so that's even a misnomer in itself, that you walk the beat and talk to citizens.
Okay.
So no one does that. I would try to be friendly with people, but really the reality is if I spent an hour talking to a citizen, that was an hour that everyone viewed I should have been out getting statistics.
And what were those statistics that you should have been hitting?
So normally it's drugs, and that's your main focus, is drugs or Part 1 crimes, which would generally be felonies that have significant jail time.
And we all know that the war on drugs was literally just started to target black radicals and the anti-war hippie movement. So,
and guns, which is a misdemeanor, but that's a big thing here. So that's everything. Like there is no walking and talking to the community. That's what you do in policing. You're trying to do what keeps you out of trouble from all of the problems that are internal. Like, I never feared the streets, but I constantly feared other officers.
How has the climate sort of in the city shifted since Freddie Gray was killed and the riots happened? I mean, these people that we just passed, like, do they live in fear of police? They live across the street from where Freddie Gray was killed.
Right, so what they fear is that we can get away with whatever we choose to get away with. The laws are to the point where anybody can be locked up pretty much for any time. Like one of the cases I did in the Senate.
So anybody can be locked up for any time. Remember that. Remember what I showed you. Hold on. He just said, remember that you can be locked up for any time. Remember this picture. Remember this. The whole time he's talking, remember this photo right here. And that this is what he's talking about black people being sent to.
In Maryland, that I testified to, was how you can't actually drive a car legally. I mean, it would be impossible. No one can get this car from here to the end of the street completely legally.
So an officer can arrest you at any moment?
At any point in time. So you're constantly ready to be a problem.
Do you want to go back to the story you were telling me?
Oh, yes, I'll get on my pal. That's also very important. So the police also are not from these neighborhoods. They literally function as an occupying military force. They're from affluent surrounding neighborhoods. A lot of the police aren't even from the state. I got arrested. The last time I got arrested was by a black cop who said he was from Boston, Massachusetts, and never experienced racism a day in his life. It's one of the saddest people I've ever met, honestly. But I'm gonna let this go.
You were called on the radio for backup.
I hear the call, and I'm not too far away from where we are right now. I'm in a position to head off the guy that's running. I get out of my car, get into a nice place, and corner the guy in an alley. He turns and sees me. We have a little bit of struggle. We get on the ground. He gets the handcuffs on, and all in all, this is just like a passively resisting arrest. No cop should ever be upset when a suspect passively resists being taken to jail. That's what you should expect. And I got him down with the handcuffs, and the officer turned the corner to the alley and just kicked him in the face as hard as he could, it seemed to be, because his face swelled up instantly. He had a nice black eye, it was a contusion.
Why does he do that? What is the kick for?
All right, so I'm guessing, but my guess is that he's pissed off that he lost the foot chase. I mean, would I be pissed off if I lost the foot chase? Yeah, I've lost foot chases. It pisses you off.
So, I mean, everyone gets angry in their jobs, right?
Yeah, can you imagine if the cashier got mad that she rung up the thing wrong and decided to punch the customer in the face?
The key thing to understand, Mike told me, is that in many cases, the officers who treat people like that are doing so because they're afraid.
I've always thought that those are the ones that actually cross a line more. It's the ones that are afraid. And that's our standard in policing, is fear. So if you're afraid, you can do whatever you want. That's the legal standard. So if I am afraid that you can take my life, then I'm allowed to take yours legally.
Where does the fear come from then? Like in the guys that do have the fear, it sounds like you think that a lot of them, or most of them do.
The pussies. I'm not afraid to say it. They were the people that were afraid before they came in, and just because you got a badge and a gun doesn't suddenly mean you're not afraid.
I don't think most people think of police officers as being afraid, as being primarily afraid.
Definitely afraid. There's cops that won't get out of their car when there's a fight with a guy and another officer.
To some extent, they're taught to be afraid, right? That we were, they've shown videos in which guys who hesitate, a second too long are blown away by some madman in the street.
Yeah,
Big facts.
Completely right. I mean, that is actually what they show you. They show you the videos. There's an infamous one of a cop who is getting shot at and actually just seems afraid to pull the trigger at another human being. Like the guy was so empathetic that he couldn't, even though he was going to lose his life, he couldn't bring himself to kill another human being. And that's a video they show all the time.
Fear, Mike said, has a nasty tendency to turn into a kind of constant low-level anger.
What feels sort of within the bounds of acceptable behavior in Baltimore, at least during the time when you were on the job, to do with your anger?
Yeah, I mean, they don't have much of a release, so I think a lot of it gets built up in bitterness of the people and of the environment, not in a productive way. They generally don't go and work out, they don't deflate themselves. Instead, they'll get angry at the citizens, give further into that us versus them, and start their infamous drinking problems that you hear about with police. That's real because it is a stressful thing.
So officers are ambiently angry and afraid for their lives at every turn. And the people they're supposed to be serving are afraid and defensive about the possibility of being hassled by a surly cop and carted off to jail for no reason. What Mike is describing is a vicious cycle, and while he's not the first guy in the world to characterize it as such, I wondered if he had any thoughts on how it might be broken.
If we actually did a community police
I'll post a link in
designed to
chat.
have decentralized power so that the patrol officer can take care of
And
things
let me know when you
in his
TikTok it so I can
his or
do
her
it.
responsibility area. So in a true community policing model, if I came down here and I see this overgrown brush, I have the power and the resources to get city workers or something like that down here to fix that. I should have the ability to get weed whackers and recruit people in the neighborhood, and maybe for that day of work, instead of locking people up, I came out with the neighborhood and did this, because that would have some kind of improvement overall.
Driving through the utterly dilapidated Sandtown neighborhood, looking at the memorial that has been erected in honor of Freddie Gray, It strikes me that clearing out...
That's what he's saying. He's not there to contribute to the community. He's not there to clear the weeds. He's not there to contribute to the community. He's there literally just to lock people up.
Overgrown bush feels like pretty small potatoes. Plus, while community policing seems like an obviously good idea in principle, it's my sense that it usually ends up being little more than a buzzword in practice. That police culture inevitably overwhelms it.
Well, that's the thing, though. I mean, I think culture, like, is the transmission of values, like, from one person to another. I don't know if it goes laterally or if it goes from, like, from the top down in terms of rank. You do as your commander or your captain says, and you think the way he thinks. But it has to, I mean, I don't know. I mean, that's what I'm asking. Like, is there a path along which change can kind of travel?
What we have to do is we have to start thinking about what are we actually doing and what are our goals. So if our goals are to reduce violent crime, we have to change our metrics. So right now our metric is arrest. That's what judges and officers. So who's in charge of these metrics? It's command and it's politicians. So we have to change the metric to crime reduction, to justice, to problem solving. So that would be a continual metric where you would always have something to do, where you would always improve the community, because you should be focused on improving your post, not on locking up many of those people up on your post. Because if you're taking their freedom away, how are you not going to be their enemy?
To close out our tour, Mike took me to a part of Baltimore that was very different from everything we'd seen so far. A white neighborhood on the north side of town. It's where he was transferred after about 4 years on the force. He found
this is up near Hamden.
He also found it difficult to make his numbers because all of a sudden he didn't have anyone to arrest. His solution? Drive 2 blocks away into a part of town where he could easily find young black men.
So who would you arrest here? For what? It seems like you need a reason.
This is near where I used to live.
That's the thing you're not understanding. So like they were in the street.
That's it?
enough.
That's enough?
Yeah, it's jaywalking. Okay, so if they throw a cigarette on the ground, you can do it. And people do those petty arrests. You'll see them. So Freddie Gray being arrested for a spring-loaded pocket knife, you can't tell me that black people carry spring-assisted pocket knives at a greater ratio than white people do. Or even Hispanics, because they're doing the construction sites around here. That's a ridiculous thing to say. Of course we all have I have a spring-assisted pocket knife. Conveniently, legally. There's an exception for police. Imagine that. So when you go and you look at the arrest records, what are you going to see? But the people here are carrying spring-assisted pocket knives at the same ratio as the people up there. So we're not focused on the crime of the spring-assisted pocket knife. We're focused on the crime of being black and poor.
Yes.
Listening to Mike talk, I found it depressingly easy to understand why distrust and hostility flow so freely between the police and the city and the communities they're supposed to be protecting. That us versus them mentality that Mike was talking about earlier, it gets reinforced and sharpened systematically, almost by design, and it poisons every interaction that cops in Baltimore have with the city's residents. Until the police figure out what the people who live here actually need from them, what it would take for officers to start improving people's lives instead of making them harder, sadder, less free, the anger and the fear that Mike Wood saw on the job are just going to persist.
We're setting the stage and then going, oh my gosh, look at this stage. Well, yeah, we created it.
Oh my god, no, I'm gonna get... Oh, fuck. Fucking music, dude. That's gonna get my stream muted. Fuck. Oh my god. I hate this shit so much. But anyway, but yeah, that's... And then it's all to turn black people into that. That's why cops exist. That is what they do. It's just a continuation of the night watch and the slave patrols. There is no reforming this. You have to get rid of it, right? If tomorrow the federal government said, okay, slavery is completely illegal, not even reserved as a punishment for a crime, the entire for-profit prison system would collapse, right? And that's why it continues to exist, because And that's why this whole abolishing private prison system shit is bullshit, is because it's more of the same, right? It's just more a socializing of slavery, right? Before, you had slavery and anyone with enough money could be a slave owner, right? Then they made it so, okay, slavery is only reserved for punishment as a crime. Then you had to be, if you had enough money, you had to own a prison, right? And you had to lease your prison to the state, and then you could make money off slavery, right? Now they're going to say, okay, you can't do that either. Now slavery is totally socialized. The state is the only place allowed to own and run prisons, but there will still be slavery in those prisons. Your tax dollars will still continue to fund slavery because you will still continue to enjoy the products that slavery produces, right? And like he said, you're not going to go to the nice neighborhoods to produce those prisoners, to produce those slaves. It's going to be who it's always been. That's why the wisdom of the older blacks is fucking stupid. Where you're talking about just mind your business, keep your nose clean, and the police won't bother you. It's fucking stupid. First of all, because you have people like Tamir Rice, Philando Castile, Elijah McClain, right? Those people. Breonna Taylor, prime example, right? But on top of that, even if you were going to live your life and dabble here and there in some drugs or what have you, Noam Chomsky said it. It's okay for the police to bust into the hood and kick the door into a crack house and arrest everyone in there, but you will never see a police officer bust into a frat party to take all the kids away for sniffing cocaine, even though it's the same fucking thing. It's just in different classes and different races of people, right? It's not about following the rules. It's not about conforming so that you can achieve safety, right? It's about acknowledging where the systems in this country come from, where the systems in this country are now, and how they're going to move forward into the future. And what do we have in the aftermath of COVID? We had a staggering number of people dead. Over 500,000 people dead because we couldn't turn the capitalism machine off for 2 fucking weeks. Right? And now, case in point, you have the courts closed on Juneteenth, so people sitting in jail awaiting fucking trial, they have to wait because courts closed. Right? It's all this symbolic bullshit, just like our first black president who deported an insane number of people, right? Who continued all of this prison shit. Now our first female black vice president used to be the fucking top cop in California who was literally talking about how she doesn't want to let people go from jail because the state makes too much fucking money from having people locked up. It's all bullshit. It's all bullshit. And people have been playing the conformity is safety game for so long, they don't even understand and they don't even acknowledge when they're contributing to this shit. It's more of that boomer mindset to where you climbed up the ladder and as soon as you got to the top rung and got off of it, you just kicked that bitch over. You didn't even kick it over. You pulled it up after you, right? You got yours. Fuck you. Fuck us, right? You fucking destroyed the planet. You fucking used up all the resources in the country to the point where my generation, we will never retire. And the Zoomers after us are even more fucked. God bless them. That's why they're so fucking crazy. Because they saw the writing on the wall already. We were deluded. We grew up in the 90s. So we have that faint glimmer of hope that things will be different. That things were moving in a progressive direction. When in reality, the world is fucking burning to death, right? The world is fucking burning to death. And they're trying to convince us that we just need to buy more electric cars and eat less meat. And we see what the hyper rich are going to do. We saw with COVID, they're just going to send all the poor people and all the people out there to work and die at their convenience so that they can make more money, right? So when the sea starts rising, places start flooding, wildfires start happening, droughts start happening, right? They're just going to fucking get on their spaceships and colonize other planets or whatever and leave our dumbasses here on Earth, right? They're going to leave the major cities and go to the areas that don't have depleted soil. It's infuriating because this shit is so obvious, and you have people that still want to believe in this liberal bullshit. It's where if we just vote hard enough, then maybe the world will stop fucking burning. Maybe police will stop indiscriminately killing black people in the streets. Right? Maybe you won't have people born into abject poverty who did absolutely nothing to deserve that other than have parents who were also born into poverty. You have these people that understand generational wealth and don't understand generational poverty. I think you just have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Just work hard to keep your nose clean until you get fucking clapped by a police officer for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, right? It's just that's what I want to get across for Juneteenth, is that there is an active genocide against black people in this country. There's an active genocide against indigenous people still. There's just the white supremacy. I've said it so many times in the past couple of weeks. The white supremacy is so endemic to American culture that people do it without even thinking about it, without even realizing it. I'm rambling, and I think I'm going to end this soon. It's already 1:11. It's Juneteenth. Happy Juneteenth, everyone. Abolish the police. End slavery. Just abolition. Abolition. If you want to have the proper worldview, then just think about abolition. Aside from all the communism and the Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, aside from all this heady philosophical bullshit, it's abolition all day. That's the most crucial and the most important, at least in my opinion. That's the centerpiece to my worldview, is abolition. If we can end slavery, we might be able to get somewhere. If we can figure out a way to make all this machinery actually work for the people and not for fuckers like Jeff Bezos and fucking Elon Musk and Richard Branson and all these other hyper rich pieces of shit who don't pay taxes, who contribute nothing to society except more debt and more bullshit, and convince other idiots that because they steal other people's inventions and market them like Teslas and fucking cheap delivery of other people's products and shit like that, we might be able to get somewhere. But until we can convince all the other poor fuckers that we are existing in a time period of neo-feudalism, because that's what this is, right? What was feudalism? The vassals, the lords and ladies and the kings and the queens and so on and so forth owned all of the land, and they just happen to let us live and work on it to make them all the money, right? And what is happening now? All these giant corporations are buying up all the land. If they had their way, we would rent forever, everywhere. They would own all the homes, and you would not own a home. You would rent. You would pay them money until you die, and then all the generations following of your family would continue to pay them rent. Right? That's what would happen if they had their way. And they're getting their wish because people are asleep at the fucking wheel and letting this type of shit happen, right? And these companies like Amazon would have you destroying your body and spending all of your time to the point where you would even be living on the warehouse property to work and make Jeff Bezos' stock profit go up a few fucking points, right? That's where we are. That's what the modern day is about. And then on top of that, you have this continued institution of slavery that we've had since before this country was established as what it is, as what we conceive of it as, the United States of America, right? 1619 and all that bullshit, right? This, what's on screen right here, this was the first thing that the Europeans did here, and they're still doing it, right? This is the United States in a nutshell. This is the essence of America right here in this picture, right? So yeah, man, I'm going to celebrate Juneteenth, but we still don't exist in a free country, man. Cuz even if you get out of this shit, you're a felon and you can't vote, you can't possess a firearm, HOAs won't rent to you or let you move into their neighborhoods. It's just, I don't know how people can live like this. I truly don't. I don't know how anyone can go through the day-to-day and be satisfied with it as long as it's not happening to them. As long as I have my job and I'm safe, then cool. It's sad, but I have no motivation to change it because I'm safe where I am. I can't live like that. I'm not one of those people. I can't accept that. So, yeah, I think I'm going to end it on that note. Happy Juneteenth. Send a black woman some money. Yeah. I hope this is coherent for the people that have been here listening. Hopefully I got some clip-worthy stuff. But yeah, thanks for watching, everyone. I think I'm going to go live later tomorrow, as in later today, the 19th. I'm going to do another another Juneteenth stream. But if I don't, I'm going to continue with how we've been rocking. Monday night, 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, New York time, the Mortal Kombat tournament. And just keep it rocking the way that I've been. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I found a nice groove. I think I'm sticking with it. And sometime in the near future, I may take a break just to work on my other content. YouTube stuff, TikTok stuff, Instagram stuff. But we'll see what shape that takes. Thank you. I appreciate that you appreciate my content. I'm glad someone does. I'm trying to reach a wider audience and get out there and be up there with the people like your Dylan Burns and your Voshes and your Destinies and stuff, because I feel like there's absolutely no shortage of my perspective on YouTube if you know where to look. There's people like Black Red Guard. There's people like Alki. There's even like, Cat Black, Angie Speaks, all these people. So it's definitely out there, but I feel like it's not as mainstream as it should be. And I would like to be the person who introduces everyone to those ideas, because I feel like I'm able to articulate myself in a way that is conducive to that. But yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks Jenna, thanks Algal, thanks Kuma, thanks Earthling. Shout out to everybody who donated. Like I said, all the donations from tonight will be going to the Reginald F. Lewis Museum of African American History here in Baltimore. So I'll count all this stuff up and send it on over before I go to bed tonight and let you all know how much it ended up being. And if you live in the Baltimore area or if you live in Maryland, maybe make a trip one day to the museum, check it out, see what they've got to offer. They could definitely use the money and the funding. But yeah, that's going to be it for me for tonight.